see now.
Yeah,
Okay, 3, 2,
1. Thank you, Paul.
And Richard, you can turn your camera off now then, I guess.
Yes.
Unless any technical issues arise.
Yeah, I'll be listening on that.
You're now live on YouTube. There you go. That's...
Okay, we're now live on... Oh, sorry.
We're now live on YouTube. I'm just testing that through the live stream, my colleagues can hear us, then we know it's broadcasting properly. Testing.
I can hear you.
Yeah, okay. So we're live on YouTube. People should be able to hear us, and good morning, everyone.
Thank you, Mr. Ferguson. Right, good morning, everyone. It's 10 o'clock and the inquiry is resumed. Can I just check that everybody can hear me and see me?
Yes, sir.
Yes?
It's about 20-second lag.
Good, that's a good start. Right, well, obviously, this is the last day of the inquiry, having done the majority of it over the last couple of weeks in person. So today, I'll just be hearing closing submissions from the National Park Authority and the appellant. This session is being live streamed, as you've probably just heard, so people that want to follow along are hopefully doing so online. Since we adjourned last week, I've received the updated list of conditions which we discussed on Thursday. Thank you for that, and also the letter from the appellant just confirming their agreement to the wording of pre-commencement conditions. So I don't think there's anything else outstanding. We talked about the planning obligation, and there'll be 14 days for that to be submitted in its executed form. But other than all of that, is there anything else that anyone wants to raise this morning?
There is from my side, so there should be 2 further documents that have found your way to you. Together with the conditions, you should have received our representations on the only condition that is in issue, condition 6, and there's a short 1-page document which sets out our representations as the appropriate wording. I hope that found its way to you as well, sir.
Yes, I've got that, thank you. And this morning, the authority has sent its comments through on condition 6 as well. I don't know if you've seen that.
I haven't seen those, but if I can ask, my team may well have done. If I can ask that they're sent to me just so I can have a quick glance through them before closing, that's fine. The only other document that we submitted was a redacted version of the option agreement. So I don't know whether that found its way to you. We submitted that because my own friend Mr. Borsdick was cross-examining Mr. Heifer, you recall, on Thursday about the option agreement, and Mr. Heifer couldn't give details about the contents of that, and we didn't want it to be left that there was any lack of transparency, so we put that in for completeness in a redacted form so it can be seen that the option agreement didn't stipulate any base level of development or the like, simply for that purpose. So.
Right, okay, yes, I did see that. Mr. Forswick, have you seen that? Yes, good. All right, thank you. Anything else then before we hear closings? Okay, well, I have had an email version of your closings, Mr. Forswick, thank you for that. And have you got that, Mr. Williams?
I have, thank you very much, sir.
Right, okay, so I'm going to hear from the authority first and then the appellant after that. So Mr. Williams, you'll send yours through before you deliver them, presumably. Yes. Good. Okay. Mr. Forsdick, can I just check that your volume's working first of all?
Yes. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, it's quite quiet, but yes, I can hear you. Okay. So if you're ready, then you can begin. Thank you.
My closing's available on the website as well. I think it's been put for members of the public who are listening, so that should be helpful. If I could just sketch out where I'm going in all this, you'll see at section A, I've got a heading, the correct starting point, which basically over a rather large chunk goes into the baseline right through to page 7. Then I look at the scale, layout and design of the proposals and the landscape and visual impacts at sections B and C at page 7 and 8 and 9. And then I get to the policy consequences of that baseline and the impacts at section D at page 11. Whether the site constitutes major development at 12. And then the case for the development at 14, which looks at each of the headings that I say the appellant has to make good. And then at page 22, you'll see the developer's approach and my criticisms of the developer's approach. Before at 24, we get to benefits and planning balance, and 25 conclusion. So that's the overall structure. So hopefully, I won't be reading all of this, as you'll recognise quite a lot of it from cross-examination. So I won't be reading all the bits that you'll already have heard. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
So, starting with the correct starting point, in considering the principal typology, scale, form, and design of development of this site, we say that the appellant adopts a seriously flawed starting point in landscape, visual, and policy terms. On a correct understanding, the site lies in an essentially rural part of the national park, exhibits many of the key landscape characteristics of this part of the national park, which makes it so special, and features in characteristic views to and through it. I then make sort of a headline point of principle. We say that the fundamental starting point is that the site is well outside any development boundary and is in a rural location in the national park, exhibiting and contributing to key landscape and visual features. This simple short point is lost in the appellant's misconceived reliance on the A3 as somehow meaning this site is part of a strategic road network junction and calling out for development. Importantly, as demonstrated by the policy framework, the countryside of the national park is almost by definition, and absent some very unusual context, the wrong place to provide a large strategic road service area or destination of choice with amongst the largest EVCP facility in Europe. It's no accident that Mr. Heffer was unable to point to any precedent in any national park for anything like this scale of development, of whatever typology. There's simply no precedent because such large-scale developments in the rural areas of the national park face formidable policy hurdles for obvious reasons. Properly understood, given its location in the rural area of the national park and exhibiting its key landscape and visual characteristics, the site is not suitable for development at all, never mind the development of this typology, scale, layout, density, intensity, and design. I'm not going to keep on repeating this basic point, but the whole concept here, we say, is simply wrong in principle. Now going into a bit more detail underneath that headline point. The site exhibits most of the landscape qualities that result in the landscape having and being worthy of the highest status of protection and contributing to the first purpose and to the foundational special quality 1. Hardly surprisingly, there are formidable policy hurdles to any development here, and a strict landscape-led framework for determining the appropriate typology, scale, and form of development. So that's the headline for this whole section. I now get into the detail. And starting with the landscape character assessment as the embodiment of SQ1 here, and the natural beauty of the national park here. The National Park Management Plan sums up that which justifies the designation of the national park. Not just stunning views, but a rich tapestry of complex landscapes reflecting geology and centuries of human influence. Or, as SQ1 puts it, a diversity of landscapes has been created in a relatively small area, which is a key feature of National Park. That rich tapestry of complex landscape contains a wide range of landscape character types. All 19 of those are combined to make the National Park so special, and thus the assessment of characteristics for each LCT tells us what it is that makes that area so naturally beautiful, how it contributes to SQ1, and what it is in the area that is to be conserved and enhanced. Each LCT is then divided down into landscape character areas, and those areas are described as discrete geographical areas that possess the common characteristics described for the landscape type. So each LCA has a distinct and recognisable local identity. The key characteristics of what independent consultants have concluded makes the landscape of this particular area special, and which justify its inclusion in the national park in the first place. They articulate what makes this part of the National Park, including the site, a diverse, inspirational landscape with and contributing to breathtaking views under SQ1. Thus, an analysis of those key characteristics and impact on them is not a standard GLVI assessment. It goes directly to SQ1. Miss Childs was plainly right in cross-examination when she said, "I do not think there is a separate SQ baseline. It is all in the landscape character." The landscape character type has to be considered further in its wider context and wider setting, and in the light of the contribution it makes to the wider whole. Again, Miss Childs was clearly correct when she pushed back on the reductive approach in cross-examination, namely to look at the site in isolation from its context. If you break the landscape down into the smallest components, she said, you can pretty much justify anything. Now, moving on to K2 and the landscape character assessment, it's now common ground, with one exception, that the site exhibits or contributes to all the relevant key characteristics of K2, which justified inclusion of this LCA in the first place. And I set them all out there, and these are... I'm getting some feedback.
Yes, somebody's just joined the meeting, and I'm not sure that their microphone is muted. So could you do that, please, whoever it is? Thank you.
I set out in those paragraphs the points I put to Mr. Fanshawe, and which he accepted were current features of the site. I just want to pick up a T, please. The site is experienced in the context of a low density of settlement or an extremely low level of dispersed settlement in between, as put in K2. But this is describing an essentially sparsely populated, overwhelmingly rural area with very limited development within which the site sits. And I'll be coming back to that point a number of points in this closing. And then obviously we have the reference to dramatic views of the chalk escarpment. Now it's of course accepted that the site does not meet the tranquility characteristic, but that would be so for all land close to the A3, and I return to the A3 below. Mr. Fanshawe's acceptance of the above point significantly undermines the appellant's approach to the baseline, and thus the starting point for considering the acceptability of development here, and removes, I say, the fundamental edifice on which the whole case is built. And that's because the appellant's starting point, that I now turn to, simply doesn't recognise any of the above. Until the cross-examination of Mr. Fanshawe, the appellant provided no analysis of the above essential landscape character of the site and its surroundings, instead ignoring or belittling those features, but more importantly, treating the site as almost entirely divorced from them. Mr. Fanshawe agreed that his approach from the outset focused on the A3 severing the site from its wider landscape and creating a traffic island in the middle of a strategic road junction, wholly divorced, his words not mine, from its wider context and from the key characteristics, such that in Mr. Dunster's words, it has no wider landscape context. That all leads to Mr. Fanshawe's starting point that the site is looking for new purpose. Consistent with that approach, his analysis has an unrelenting focus on the claimed negative elements, all of which are significantly overstated. First of all, the traffic island point and the severance point, then the rough and poorly maintained grazing point, being a hub or confluence of the transport system, and having numerous areas of development in the corridor with inevitable and understandable development pressures, as if those development pressures were somehow acceptable in this corridor. All these elements are combined to give the impression that the site makes no contribution to the landscape or visual baseline and is ripe for development, cut off, spoilt and unloved, as put in cross-examination of Miss Childs. As to the elements that count the other way, those that show the current site has value as part of the LCA, and to the limited extent that the presence of those elements is recognised at all, they're all worded in a negative or pro-development way. And I'll set those all out in that paragraph. We say that that approach results in the appellant leaving key elements of the baseline out of consideration. Then turn to the A3, which was so important to Mr. Fanshawe's baseline. We say that more fundamentally, the focus on the A3 distorts everything else. The appellant relies throughout on the dominance and impacts of the A3, creating the claimed island and providing what it claims is the fundamental landscape and visual context for the site. But that reliance is misplaced and overstated. In that context, it's important to note that there were attempts to exclude the A3 corridor from the national park at the outset, but they failed. It was correctly accepted that the A3 affects the landscape to some degree, and the visual impacts of the road were very localised. It was thus appropriate to include the corridor in the national park. Prior to the new A3, the site was a small irregular pastoral field, as shown in Miss Child's rebuttal, with tree boundaries, a stream, a road to the north, and the old A3 to the east on its current alignment. The new A3 has the following consequences. First, the B2070 was moved slightly further south, taking part of the field, but a new replacement tree screen was created there. The new A3 itself and its banks are almost all off the old field, except in the bottom southwest corner. The eastern boundary, the trees there and the stream are unchanged. Despite the appellant's repeated assumptions, its own environmental statement makes clear that the site itself is not made ground. The broad, irregular and small shape of the field remains, as shown in Miss Child's rebuttal, page 17, such that the site's historic boundaries have been changed, but not changed to the extent that it has lost its essential landscape characteristics. Miss Child's answer in cross-examination. The topography and the geology remains, the woodland and the stream on the east remain. The general pattern on the site is replicated in the post-A3 world, and the key patterns of the field are not altered. All that has happened in landscape character terms is that a major new road has been added into the landscape, a considerable change, of course, but not one which removes or substantially detracts from the fundamental landscape characteristics of the site and its surroundings. The A3 itself is remarkably well contained within its corridor, as is clear from Butser Hill all the way from the south of Petersfield to beyond the site, all agreed by Mr. Fanshawe, with well-treed highway verges and flowing through the field pattern and the landscape, with the historic landscape being retained right up to its edge, with no hinterland development and with no impact on settlement pattern. None of that is reflected in Mr. Fanshawe's baseline. The landscape character of the east and west of it remains of the same type, K2. The fundamental point is that the essential features of the wider landscape context of the site and the site itself remain wholly or largely unchanged by the A3. Except for noise tranquility, the A3 does not remove or substantially impact all the other landscape character elements as noted in the designation report. The essential characteristics of the site and the area remain directly contrary to Mr. Fanshawe's original baseline. It was suggested in cross-examination of Miss Childs that if the inspector agrees that the field pattern is not extant, that makes the appeal site exceptional out of the norm. The converse is also true. There is nothing in landscape terms to take this field out of the norm and to justify its development, and development of any other field in the open countryside would be obviously unacceptable. Then address condition versus character, and the site has been poorly managed and overgrazed. Those features go to condition, not character. They're reversible. The current grazing use is a choice. There's no evidence that the site is unviable or has been marketed for agriculture. One has to look beyond the ephemeral condition of the site to its intrinsic landscape and visual quality. The repeated reliance on the current condition of the site is misplaced. And then move on to the visual baseline. Local views of and through the site, of which the bus stop is just the most obvious. I would ask you to note footnote 3 there. It was put in cross-examination as the litmus test and not the only relevant viewpoint in the locality. Local views of and through the site will have been seen on your site visit. All the relevant key characteristics of the landscape character area are evident on and around the site and contribute to those views. The site is seen in its wider landscape context, most particularly with the rural, intimate and enclosed low-lying landscape in the foreground, with the dramatic escarpment rising beyond. The impact of the A3 on the local views has been overstated. Of course, on site, one can see cars on the A3 going past
Everyone's on mute.
through the trees, as shown in Miss Child's rebuttal appendices, and the noise is intrusive. But from outside the site and in views through the site, the A3 is of no substantial significance. Indeed, from the boundaries to the east, the A3 is not visible at all. Indeed, all the LVE viewpoints chosen by the appellant are remarkable in how little they show of the A3. From Butser Hill, there is a sublime panoramic view, not just of East Meon, but to the east and north-east too. Mr. Dunster was correctly described it in evidence in chief as one of the best views in the southeast and the best possible introduction to the national park. Visitors have a kinetic view as they walk from between viewpoints 5, 6 and D on a designated red route and with interpretive boards to assist visitors appreciate that sublime view. The view is representative view 8 in document B7. Those views are identified because they reveal the special qualities of the national park, provide natural observation points from which to appreciate landscape character, and are marked as key viewpoints on the Ordnance Survey. The rural and diverse agricultural nature of this area, embodied in the key characteristics, is what makes this view so breathtaking with the settlement pattern to which Ruth Charles referred. The interior of the site can be readily seen in that view. It is evidently a small irregular field in grazing use. The A3 junction, I should say, is not visible. The road infrastructure is not dominant. The site is and presents in that view as part of the rich tapestry that makes the view so spectacular. From Butser Head, all the key characteristics are readily evident, in particular the diverse field pattern and the exceptionally low density of small settlements. Greenway Lane is a discordant feature which in views from Butser Hill draws the eye towards it and the appeal site. The undeveloped and rural, non-discordant nature of the site is a part of that whole, therefore contributing to the whole. It's also relevant to consider views from the A3, a key corridor through the national park, from which its special qualities can be experienced. From the A3, the site is indistinguishable from the pattern of other fields along the A3 south of Petersfield. Immediately upon leaving Petersfield, the rich tapestry of the rural landscape is evident below the escarpment, with no development visible, highly dispersed settlement pattern, highly rural, and the site is consistent with and a part of all that. The result of that baseline, I say that paragraph 2 flows from that baseline. This is simply the wrong place for substantial development. It's noticeable that all the other witnesses rely on Mr. Fanshaw's baseline. On his own acceptance now as the key characteristics of the site, the starting point for all those matters that I set out and you'll be familiar with are necessarily wrong because they all adopt Mr. Fanshaw's former position. This is not a marginal case. The ultimate exception by Mr. Fanshaw of all the cross-examination on the key characteristics shows us that when the correct baseline question is asked in the correct way, there is only one answer. The site exhibits and contributes to the key characteristics of K2, which constitute the special quality 1 of this landscape area and views to and through the site. The baseline, properly understood, thus fundamentally undermines Mr. Dunster's logic at section 5 of his proof as to why this site is suitable for development at all. It is not detached from the rural landscape or traffic island in a landscape or visual sense, as he claims. The A3 does not break the settlement pattern. The A3 is not indisputably the dominant feature of the site surroundings. It is not almost impossible to see into the site when passing on the A3 or elsewhere in the surroundings, and it is wrong to claim that the site can be barely seen from Bunster Hill. Exhibiting all relevant K2 characteristics, the site contributes to the foundational SQ1, contrary to his view. He inevitably accepted in cross-examination that each of the conclusions in section 5 were fundamental to his design approach. As I've shown above, he is wrong on all of those points. Contrary to his approach, the site is not a blank canvas, or as Mr. Fanshaw would have it, looking for new purpose. I then set out the scale, layout and design of the proposal, which will all be very familiar to you, and I don't propose to read that. I then move on to section C, which is the landscape and visual impacts. You've had the advantage of a full site visit, and you've been able to observe the matters considered in the evidence on site, and therefore I can take this relatively slowly. I start with the landscape-led approach. The typology, scale, layout, form, and design of the proposals have all followed on from the flawed baseline referred to above. In addition to his section 5, Mr. Dunster's position was the site was as follows. The site's not representative of the wider landscape character of the national park. For all intents and purposes, the site is not visible to the majority of receptors. It's virtually impossible to see, and no car parking can be seen from outside the site. There's effectively no wider landscape context, mainly due to the A3. There's no relevant settlement pattern. The site is dominated and overwhelmed by the A3. Given that position, it necessarily follows that as the baseline is so flawed, a landscape-led approach, as meant by SD4, cannot have been applied here, because the landscape-led approach fundamentally requires a full and proper understanding of the landscape context of the site into which the development will be placed. We say that a landscape-led approach here would dictate rejection of large-scale development of any typology, never mind one of this density, intensity, layout, and design as proposed. Then turn shortly to the strategic impacts on landscape character. And we say that at a strategic scale, the development introduces dense and intense development onto and to the boundaries of a 2.5 hectare field in the countryside of the national park, creating a fundamental land use change with consequent urbanisation, inimical to its rural location and to the existing settlement pattern. The site changes from a small irregular field, intimate and enclosed, in a rural environment characterised by extremely sparse settlements, to a dense and intense developed site, equivalent to a new large settlement, with many urbanising features and totally alien to its context. Large commercial destinations in the open countryside and rural areas of a national park are fundamentally inconsistent with the purpose of designation and with the key characteristic of the national park in this location and with its visual qualities. The proposal is very substantially larger than any of the local farmsteads and similar settlements that have been referred to by Miss Childs in Table 1. It's 3.5 times the scale of Greenway Lane. It would be akin to a new settlement in the sense meant by Miss Childs and the way that that word is used in for example, the LCA. But the terminology used is not important. It is the fact of the scale of the development in the rural area and within the existing settlement pattern, which is important. This will be a substantial new settlement development in an area with an extremely low level of dispersed settlement between villages. Or put another way, this is a large new development in the middle of an overwhelmingly rural area in what is currently an extremely dispersed settlement pattern. It visually tends to join to or agglomerate with Greenway Lane, creating a perceptual impression of the two settlements being one. It introduces an alien form and scale of development into the hinterland of the A3, which remains largely characteristic and intact, with the survival of the fieldscape and field boundaries. The absence of existing urban features in this hinterland is stark. We then go on to localised impacts on landscape character. And in terms of the localised effect, the form of the settlement does not reflect the grain or any element of the design of existing settlements. No attempt having been made to identify positive patterns and precedents to inform a well-integrated design, or to reflect how local settlements all exhibit organic growth and strongly rural features. It has the features that I then set out, and you're very well aware of those, and I won't read those. I do just simply highlight that Mr. Dunster accepted that on all of those matters, that he was unable to take any cue from its landscape contextual, he took no landscape contextual or design cue on any of those matters from the surrounding area. Ms. Child's localised assessment and Mr. Waller's comments on design have withstood scrutiny, and I commend it to you, sir. The short point is that the site currently exhibits the key characteristics of this quintessentially national park landscape and the proposals will, by dint of intense and dense development and its design and layout, transform it into something akin to a service area, with all the key characteristics being either directly undermined or becoming divorced from their context. In terms of visual impacts, the local views will be readily visible and intrusive in local. The development will be readily visible and intrusive in local views, presenting as a large-scale alien and urbanising incursion into the landscape. Along the northern boundary, the much enlarged visibility display will open the views through the development, with the scale and form of the line of the pods and the road infrastructure being readily experienced in the foreground. The rural views will be transformed. On the other boundaries, anyone in the area will be aware from glimpses through and around the site that what was formerly a field in an overwhelmingly rural area is now an intense and dense development. Similarly, on the A3, the development will be clearly visible through the trees. The existing planting on the west will be of limited additional depth and tightly spaced, will compete upwards, leaving a clear view through below the canopy, introducing intense and dense development into views where currently, all the way from Petersfield south, no built form is experienced. At night, those on the local road network and the A3 will be aware the site is now a dense and intense development, not least because of the glow. The short point is that the current views are overwhelmingly of a rural landscape, exhibiting the key features of K2, including the escarpment beyond, and will be transformed into views where the development in the foreground is a discordant, alien, and wholly unexpected feature. The development will be readily visible and intrusive in the sublime view from Butser Hill, broadly equivalent in distance to the farm to the west of the A3, which is clearly visible from Butser Hill. It will have been evident from the site visit that the Hay-Davison Appendix D does not accurately reflect the current visibility of the site, and thus what will be experienced with the development in place. Mr. Fanshawe accepts that the visual impacts he assesses are highly dependent on the tree screen on the boundary of the site on highway land. There is no means to secure that screen long term and no agreement with National Highways to do so. Assuming the screen remains in place, he considers that the moderate current harm to this view will over the years be mitigated by tree growth, not predominantly by new planting. He relies on the existing trees being 12 to 15 metres tall and there being a further 5 metres of growth over the next 10 years to hide that which can currently be clearly seen. His 12 to 15 metre figure is wrong. The correct figure is 6 to 8 metres. In any event, there is no evidence that these 30-year-old trees are growing at anything like the rate necessary to provide the screening effect on which Mr. Fanshawe relies. Further, the consequences of ash dieback in terms of the fullness of the existing screen on the western boundary are not addressed in Appendix D, but we know there will be significant loss in this area ultimately, resulting in felling, and even if there is replanting, the screen will be diminished for many years. It is notable how much importance Mr. Fanshawe places on the screen. The necessary corollary is that he accepts it is necessary to screen the development from views. The authority agrees. That necessity arises because it is such a discordant and alien feature in the landscape. I then deal with night sky, sir, and this is almost word for word cross-examination that I put to Mr. Spreadborough, and so I wasn't going to dwell on any of it. If I can just go to paragraph 59 and pick up there. As ILP states, even a small change in the sensitive location may have important consequences. Here, there will be a noticeable increase in visibility of light on and from the site, giving rise to moderate adverse impacts. That will, by definition, impact the dark night sky readings and thus fail to conserve and enhance the intrinsic quality of dark night skies in that area, contrary to SD81. And by that area, I mean the southern area at the bottom of the site on the A3 slip roads. The result of all that is there'll be significant adverse landscape and visual impacts undermining the key characteristics of the site and its context, identified in K2, significantly impacting its natural beauty and being inimical to the foundational SQ1. I then turn to the policy consequences of all of that. The above harm is direct harm to the first, and we say primary, statutory purpose of national parks. It is to be accorded great weight. and the absence of harm to cultural heritage or minor benefits to wildlife and biodiversity net gain cannot legitimise or outweigh that harm here. Similarly, the attempt to offset harm to the foundational SQ1 by minor benefits or neutrality under other SQ heads is flawed. The focus has to be on the natural beauty, and that is embodied in SQ1. All the other SQs are related to, flow from, or are designed to support and be consistent with SQ1. It is impossible to conceive of a situation where significant harm to SQ1 and natural beauty can be offset by, for example, a positive score on the recreation SQ5. It's accepted, of course, that there are some benefits to some people from having opportunities to experience the special qualities, but that is at the expense of undermining for everyone the foundational special quality they are here to experience. We say that's a basic contradiction. As made clear in the reasons for refusal, the harms mean the proposal to have a wide range of policy consequences. They breach SD 4.1 because by definition the landscape character properly understood is not conserved or enhanced. They breach 4.3 because they undermine the settlement pattern and the integrity of the predominantly open and undeveloped land between settlements. They fail to comply with 5.1 because the site design is not landscape-led and does not respect local character and make a positive contribution. 6.1 because they do not preserve the visual integrity, identity and scenic quality of the national park. The proposals fail to conserve and enhance sequential views under 6.3 and fail to conserve and enhance representative view 8 in B in paragraph 2A and 2C. They breach SD 23.1G because they are beyond the settlement boundary and do not positively contribute to the natural beauty of the national park. They cannot comply with SD 25 because even if exceptionally there is an essential need for countryside location, there still has to be compliance with the relevant policies of the local plan, including 4 to 6 above. Irrespective of the other headings of SD 23, the proposals cannot comply with it as a whole because out-of-settlement development must positively contribute to and not adversely affect the character and appearance of the area. The development's design is inconsistent with SD 23.1D as well. And of course, one here has to demonstrate exceptional circumstances under SD 1.4, where the benefits demonstrably outweigh the P1 harm, to which great weight must be attached, and there is substantial compliance with the other policies of the plan. I then move on to whether the development constitutes major development, and in short, the answer is a clear and unambiguous yes, it does. The proposals, Mr. Heffer relies on 3 factors to justify his conclusion that the proposals are not major development: the landscape and visual impacts, which he's taken from Mr. Fanshawe, his useful precedents that he refers to in Mr. Heffer's summary, paragraph 1.10, and then in his main proof, and the modest scale of the proposals. In terms of the landscape and visual impacts, Mr. Heffer's case on this relies on Mr. Fanshawe being correct. The appellant contends that the potential for landscape impact is the most important factor, and here claims that there are no significant such impacts. Conversely, if there are any significant adverse impacts or the potential for them, that will, on the appellant's own logic, strongly suggest it is major development. In terms of precedent, in short summary, all the precedents relied on by Mr. Heffer are obviously incomparable in scale, location, type, and potential for impacts, whilst those provided by Mr. Ferguson indicate that the proposals are major development. Adopting the logic of the examples, this is not a remotely marginal case. And I said during cross-examination of Mr. Heffer that I had a number of points on each of the examples, and you said to make them in closing, so I'm making them here. Can I pick up, please, from D? By the point of getting to D, I've looked through the 3 main examples made by Mr. Heffer, and if I can pick up at 3. I say it's difficult to understand how any expert could have put any of the above forward as useful precedents, but it gets much worse. In evidence, Mr. Heffer focused on Butser Quarry, the site already had permission for all the extraction and a low-value restoration scheme. The proposals were to bring forward restoration and an improved restoration scheme, thus reducing the duration of landscape and visual harm and improving the final position. Mr. Heffer does not explain how in those circumstances there was any scope for any significant adverse impact as required by footnote 60 of the NPPF. Mr. Heffer was plainly wrong when he said that whether the impacts are good or bad was not a factor to be taken into account. I then deal shortly with Marwell, which you can take as read, and then come to the screening opinion sought by Amberley. The screening opinion and major development questions are completely different. He's now accepted in cross-examination, not quite the same thing as he claimed in evidence in chief. Reliance on the screening opinion there as illuminating the major development question here is misconceived. Conversely, Mr. Heffer did not attempt to rebut the relevance or significance of Mr. Ferguson's examples to inspector decisions for much lesser scale of pod-type developments. Just looking at Trimmingham, that comprised an extension to an existing holiday park in the countryside for 56 units, broadly similar scale to just the pods here, on 2.5 hectares overall, including all the landscape areas on the plan that Mr. Ferguson has appended. The inspector rejected the purely numeric approach and found the site to be characteristic, high sensitivity landscape with a loss of appreciable area of open rolling countryside and a significant footprint. If that scale of development is major development, it's difficult to conceive how the current proposals are not. I then turn to modest, and Mr. Heffer's whole approach is made clear by his view that this is modest scale development, and he by any reasonable standard, quote. It will host, on the contrary, it will host amongst the largest EVCP in Europe, has a 60-unit, more than 100-bedroom, inverted commas, hotel, accommodating up to 200 people, a 150-metre-long commercial building whose scale has no precedent anywhere beyond the settlement boundary in the national park, 130 covers, 127-space car park, which is said to be modest in comparison with a town centre Tesco's, the relevance of which is not understood, with all the dimensions in ID20 and the layout features described by Mr. Waller. This is clearly not modest development, and therefore we say this is clearly major development. So how can a case for the development be made out against that backdrop? I've set out the policy hurdles above. If the development is judged harmful to the natural beauty of the national park, those policy hurdles will apply. The hurdles are necessarily and inevitably set very high, and in the balance required by those policies, the harm is to be accorded great weight. Given the breaches of the policy set out in the reasons for refusal as summarised above, to overcome the reasons for refusal, the appellate needs to properly address and meet the following policy requirements. First of all, demonstrate that the proposals that the benefits demonstrably outweigh the great weight attached to the harm, and that there's substantial compliance with all the other relevant policies. Irrespective as to any harm to P1, only exceptionally will development outside the settlement boundaries be permitted, and so far as relevant here, that will be where there is an essential need for a countryside location. Countryside of the national park is protected against all development except, exceptionally, that for which the countryside location is shown to be essential. If the development is major development, and again, irrespective as to any harm to P1, permission will be refused except in exceptional circumstances and where it can be demonstrated the proposals are in the public interest. Considerations include need, alternative ways of meeting the need, and any detrimental effects on P1, P2, and whether they can be mitigated. That framework, and I'm trying to summarise the overall gist of that framework here, is that it puts need, alternatives, public interest, and essential need for a country location at the heart of this case, if there is to be any plausible route to a grant. The short points under this framework are as follows. First of all, the benefits are recognised, but do not come close to outweighing the great weight to be attached to the harm. There is no demonstrated essential need for any element to have a countryside location. The holistic mix is contrived, and even it cannot meet the essential need for countryside location requirement. There's no demonstrated need for most elements of the proposal, no alternative site search or explanation as to why there are other non-holistic ways of meeting the need are not available, and as demonstrated earlier, an understatement of the detrimental effects. The appellant relies on its holistic approach as overcoming the hurdles in B and C above. That reliance is misplaced on the facts and in principle. I come to the facts below, but as to the principle, I say that one cannot create a unique or novel mix of uses and then contend that the whole is needed as a single whole and can only be looked at as a single whole, and then address all the policy requirements only on that holistic basis. To adopt that approach emasculates the policy framework. For example, a need for just one element would, on the appellant's logic, justify the whole. It opens the door to major development, contrary to the basic proposition of NPPF 177, and fails to give effect to the NPPF 177 requirements, not least alternative ways to meet the needs through disaggregation. To meet the reasons for refusal and the requirements of the policies, the appellant contends that this location provides a unique opportunity for a novel concept, meeting a wide range of needs in an holistic way, bringing synergistic benefits. On examination, each element of that logic falls away. But therefore, with the location, the site's close to the junction on the A3. In need terms, that is its fundamental locational characteristic, leading to the original proposals for a gateway service station to a motorway service area brief. The A3 is a key radial route out of London, part of the strategic road network, and provides strategic links between London, the M25 and Guildford on the one hand, and Portsmouth and the M27 on the other, carrying 57,000 vehicles per day. Mr. Marshall accepted that the vast majority of traffic on it will be passing through the national park and not starting or finishing its journey in it, and will be either commuting between the main conurbations at either end of it or be on the longer strategic journeys. Further, traffic leaving at this junction currently will be overwhelmingly have a local start or local endpoint, and thus no need to charge here. The flows on the A272 at the Petersfield junctions are a small proportion of flows on the A3, confirming that the overwhelming flow passing the site is north-south directly through and not stopping in the national park. Fundamentally, the only relevant A3 need is for rapid EVCP. Ms. Norton does not quantify the extent of that need. It is in any event not location specific, does not have an essential need for a countryside location, and then there's no evidence it could not be met as any existing junction or petrol filling station outside the national park, such as is being promoted at Liphook. There is no claimed need for a new car park here to serve Queen Elizabeth Country Park or Butser Hill, or for a commercial destination of choice or an EV showroom. There's no locationally specific need for overnight accommodation here or of this scale. Policy does not aim to meet the needs of through travellers on the A3 in the national park. There's no essential need, therefore, for any of the proposals to have a countryside location. The location means that the development will be overwhelmingly car dominated and by internal combustion engine vehicles in its early years. Mr. Marshall stated in evidence in chief that it's relatively accessible by non-car modes, given its rural location. But that does not mean it can sensibly be expected to be accessed through such modes. And it is obvious that overwhelmingly people will arrive here by car, undertake visits from here by car, and leave by car. The site is relatively close to the Queen Elizabeth Country Park and Butser Hill, but that proximity does not somehow justify a need for this scale and form of development here. That's location. I then turn to need and start with electric vehicle charging points. In summary, I summarise the case first and then I get into the meat of it. In summary, properly understood, this is not an EVCP-led sustainable scheme with EVCP as the linchpin, but a commercial destination in an inappropriate location seeking to justify itself by reference to its. There is a fundamental disconnect between the claimed EVCP need and what is proposed. Mr. Dunster accepted there was a fundamental premise of his approach that there was a need for slow and fast EVCP to serve the A3. That fundamental premise is wrong. There is no such need, as Miss Norton accepted. Fundamentally, that claimed need and the consequent scale of car parking, EVCP and commercial building has been self-generated and artificially generated by creating the destination here, with the whole ethos being to generate long dwell times at the commercial destination of choice. The approach is circular. There is a need here because the development is here, but it begs the basic question as to whether the self-generated needs should be generated here at all. They self-evidently should not be. EVCP is claimed to be the linchpin of the vision for the proposals, with range anxiety being the principal challenge, with a particular focus on the A3. We know that by definition that will be overwhelmingly long distance journeys, long distance through journeys on the A3. It's of course accepted that there's a national, regional and local need for a huge rollout of EVCPs in appropriate location as EV take-up increases. Ms. Norton's figures show the extent of the challenge and are not in dispute. However, she does not assess the extent of the rapid charging need on the A3 or the opportunities to meet that need. The cross-examination of Mr. Ferguson proceeded on the express assumption that there is a need for every EVC potential site, so that the search for alternatives was not relevant. That approach has no evidential basis. Ms. Norton did not attempt to so demonstrate. All that can be said on the evidence is there is a need for increased rapid charging provision at broadly 25-mile intervals to address range anxiety on long-range journeys using the A3. The data and the green shading on the plans tell us no more than that, and the latter, surprisingly, encompasses all areas along the strategic road network and around the main towns. I then set out the three categories of charging, which you'll recognise from the cross-examination. And if I can just pick up at C, please. The third category is charging on long journeys, predominantly on the strategic road network. And by definition, given the purpose, that charging will be rapid. The basic logic is to have rapid charging to limit dwell times so that long distance journeys are as close as possible in terms of the experience to the current petrol filling station experience, as Miss Norton repeatedly stated unprompted. Charge speed and short dwell times are central to the purpose. As Mr. Marshall recognised, the current position will change rapidly over time as more government funding becomes available through the 950 million Rapid Charging Fund and as demand increases, with PFS operators extending their sites, as at Liphook, providing EVCPs in their car parks, or an element of conversion of their existing pumps, and grid-serve type operations being rolled out of the sort of scale in Mr. Ferguson's rebuttal. There is nothing in Ms. Norton's evidence in grid-serve's approach, in the approach of petrol filling station operators, or in national or local policy to suggest that this rollout will justify substantial new destinations or new service areas in the open countryside, never mind the national park. The vast majority of journeys are short journeys from home to local destinations with charging potential at both ends, and with that being far preferable to having to sit and wait for charging en route. Even the sort of commute relied on in cross-examination of Mr. Ferguson, Havant to Woking, is one where range anxiety will rarely be a problem, with charging opportunities at both ends, and if there is a problem en route, then the need will be for rapid charging. We say, therefore, there's no justification for building a new destination with slow and fast EVCPs as their linchpin. The need is to fit such EVCPs into existing destinations. The proposals here are for all but 12 of the EVCPs to be slow or fast. They are therefore not directed at the A3 need. Mr. Dunster accepted that fundamental to the logic of his whole scheme is that there is a need for a large number of slow, fast and rapid charging facilities to serve the A3. There is no such need. I could just stop there. The demonstrated need is for extra rapid EVCPs only somewhere on the A3. The linchpin of the scheme is misconceived and a fundamental part of the logic for it falls away. There is a small rapid element provided, but no attempt to assess whether the need that would meet could be met elsewhere, at existing petrol filling stations like Liphook or Petersfield, or at a grid-serve type facility outside the national park, at existing urban junctions, or as extensions to existing PFSs. That scale of provision is readily deliverable, even on Miss Norton's conversion figures at existing PFSs, or on grid-serve scale developments at existing junctions. The dwell times will be limited and the ancillary accommodation thus limited too. There would be no need for a large commercial building, an 83-space car park and all the associated highway infrastructure. All the other categories of EVCP need are generating by putting the development here, by putting a commercial building, a large hotel, it should actually be in inverted commas, and car park here. One creates the destination that in turn requires slow and fast charging. But that is the wrong way round. It presupposes the development is appropriate here and that there is a need to have EVCPs to serve it. Fundamentally, absent the development, there is no need for slow and fast charging here. Indeed, Miss Norton confirmed that the need arose from the presence of the destination. One cannot generate a destination, then claim there is a need for EVCP to serve it, and then make the provision of the ECP the linchpin of the justification for the scheme. Another clear illogical circularity. The destination of choice. Mr. Heffer balked at the suggestion that the proposal was intended to be a destination for very good reason. In planning terms, there can be no possible basis for generating a new destination in the countryside of the national park. Yet that is precisely what Mr. Dunster has sought to create with the commercial building, the destination of choice within the park, and a unique visitor experience, he says. The whole ethos is to encourage visitors to dwell longer and engage with the local food, drinks and farm shop, hence the mix of EVCP charging speeds being deliberately and heavily focused towards the slower end. The long dwell times are fundamental to the project. We need to recharge people as well as their cars, the DAS says. The destination choice requirements generate the scale of the commercial building, and the long dwell times envisaged for such a destination generate the size of the car park and the number of ECBPs. Mr. Marshall's car park size is justified by reference to the scale of the commercial building and not the other way round, the size of the commercial building being dictated by the scale of the rapid charging need. There's no policy justification or need for a destination of choice here. It's impossible to conceive of policy supporting a large new commercial destination beyond the settlement boundaries of the national park. Mr. Heffer accepts there's no evidence of a need for it. It's directly inconsistent with the overarching development strategy in SD25, and there's no attempt to demonstrate an essential need for a countryside location for it. As to visitor accommodation, it's accepted there's a general need to meet the needs of visitors to the national park. There's no identified or policy need, though, to provide overnight accommodation for through travellers on the A3. The accommodation here will broadly equally serve through traffic on the A3 and visitors to the national park. Slightly more of the latter, I think, was Mr. Marshall's Mr. Marshall's answer. There is a supported policy framework for visitor accommodation within the settlement boundaries in SD23, and where, but only where, the proposal will make a positive contribution to P1 beyond the settlement boundaries. This proposal cannot meet that for reasons I've already gone through. The result of the policy framework is a pipeline of permissions, including at Marwell and elsewhere beyond the settlement boundaries. There is no evidence that new or existing visitor accommodation for visitors to the national park requires subsidy from business through travellers, and the location of those permissions demonstrate that a strategic road network location is not required to make them viable, nor is anything like this scale required. The authority grants permission for visitor accommodation in the national park where appropriately located and of an appropriate scale, as demonstrated by Marwell. Then move to biogas and off-grid. It's claimed the capacity issues of the grid make it necessary to have off-grid technology. The appellant's own evidence shows that to be wrong. Ms. Norton put this information forward without any caveat. It was used as the appropriate planning tool, and there is no better evidence presented by her or others. She can hardly distance herself from her own assessment when the consequences of what it shows for the need for the off-grid here is highlighted. There is ample spare capacity for EVCP at the substations all along the A3 in 2025. The lights will not go out if there is on-grid rapid EVC provision, as Mr. Dunster claimed. It's not appropriate to look beyond 2025 for the reasons given by Ms. Norton. The national grid is in the process of being heavily upgraded as an essential step on the route to net zero, with massive investment to allow it to distribute the huge increase in electricity demand as renewable energy replaces carbon. The result of all that is that there's a need for rapid EVCP somewhere on the A3, but not slow or fast. There's no arguable need for a destination of choice on the A3 or generally, or for a car park here to serve QECP or Butser Hill. There is need for more tourist accommodation, but it can be met within the settlement boundary and only outside the settlement boundary when it makes a positive contribution to Purpose 1. There's no need for through traveller accommodation. There's no need for an EV showroom here. There's no need for EVCP on the A3 to be off-grid. The mix of uses based on a claim need is contrived. Then turn to the countryside location and demonstrate there all matters that I think this is basically pulling together the things I've already said, so I'm not going to read that. There's no evidence of any of this needing a countryside location. Alternative sites and alternative ways of meeting the need. The terminology of NPPF 177 goes far beyond just an alternative site search, the need for which is necessarily implicit. It requires consideration of alternative means of meeting the need and is thus in stark contrast to the sequential tests as interpreted in Tesco and Dundee. Consideration of disaggregation is a necessary part of that exercise. There has been no alternative site search for any element of the proposal individually, not even for EVCPs at other junctions or other existing service areas. There's been no assessment of alternative means to meet the claim need, including by disaggregation. It's impossible for NPPF 177 to be properly assessed without addressing that issue, because treating the scale and form of a holistic typology as a fixed requirement without testing alternatives would be to open the door to major development in the national park, directly contrary to policy. It is thus no answer to assert, as it is here, that the proposals are holistic and need to be considered as a whole. I then turn almost finally to the developer's approach, and I start with the history, and I pick up on the I pick up on the option that I was sent the other days. We say that the history, as I'm going to demonstrate here, fixes the typology and scale. This is a commercial-led typology and scale. The site was marketed in 2019 on the assumption that it was suitable for significant development. Albany bid based on the Gateway service station concept, worked up by Mr. Dunster and embodied in its pre-application proposals. There is no evidence it had carried out any policy or landscape baseline appraisal at this point. The proposals were obviously wholly unacceptable, and nobody at this inquiry has even started to try to justify them. They indicate, however, the basic approach to this site, that it was considered appropriate for very significant development, and indicates the sort of quantum Albany had in mind. We now know that Albany secured the option at that time at a fixed, albeit redacted price. That price will no doubt have reflected the Gateway service station aspirations. That option remains, and the price to be paid under it will have been a key factor in the subsequent evolution of the design, a fixed constraint demanding a dense and intense development here. As Mr. Dunster said in cross-examination, no quantum of development was required, but there was a general wish to make the development viable, and this required reasonable facilities for income generation to cover infrastructure, land purchase, income potential, costs, and all the things tied up with viability. It's thus clear that Albany and Recharge had high expectations as to the quantum of development the site could and should accommodate. Those expectations informed its bid and the land price, and that then became a fixed parameter for later work requiring a high quantum of development and the full range of uses. The holistic scheme is a response to that constraint. It is a construct to maximise commercial returns. Mr. Heffer's exposition of the need for the holistic approach is heavily predicated on what he terms the viability of the scheme, by which he seems to mean the ability to justify the purchase price under the option. It was he and not the authority who raised viability. He was claiming that the whole was needed to make each element viable as the basis for the holistic approach. So at RH435, he talked about public EV only being viable because of the lodges bore the costs of the development. 436, significant marriage value, and each element was not viable on its own. 570 and 580, the visitor accommodation was not viable without business travellers. Of course, there's no obligation to prove viability, but if that is the basis of the holistic approach, there is an obligation to provide the evidential base to justify that approach. Mr. Hever has provided no viability evidence, despite this apparently being the mainstay of his holistic case. The unevidenced assertions he made are implausible. GridServe provide new EVCPs without subsidy, as do PFS operators. The suggestion that one needs visitor accommodation to subsidise them is belied by the rollout of examples across the country. Visitor accommodation is provided across the national park without reliance on the strategic road network and without reliance on through travellers, contrary to the assumption underpinning 570 and 580. The idea that a large commercial destination on the trunk road is not viable without overnight accommodation is simply not credible, yet it is said that all the elements depend on each other for viability. What appears to be really meant, though, throughout all this is that the developer needs the total mix and scale of development to make the agreed land price stack up. As a matter of basic principle, the price agreed cannot be used to require a scale and mix of development which would otherwise not be acceptable. The lack of evidence to sustain a viability enabling need type argument removes a key justification of Mr. Heffer's holistic approach. The mix of uses is not justified by reference to viability considerations. That leaves only the claimed synergies to justify the unique novel mix of uses. It's not accepted that one can create a unique mix of uses and then use synergies between them to claim that the whole is needed, that there is no alternative site for the proposal as a whole, or that the whole has an essential need for a countryside location. Such an approach is inimical to the policy framework and would, as here, result in elements for which there is no need, having that need generated for them as part of the whole, artificially constraining the search for alternatives and bypassing the essential need for countryside location policy. However, even adopting the appellant's approach, several of the claimed synergies have been exaggerated. The claim that off-grid is required and that biogas is the appropriate response led to a claimed synergy with heating the pods and providing hot water to them to avoid wasting heat generated in the cell. Dr. Roy was clear that the technology is such that if the heat is not required, the system uses the heat generated to power the cell. There is thus no necessity for accommodation to use the heat generated. Any accommodation could have solar panels and use the electricity generated to power the accommodation and any associated EVCP, with any excess exported to the grid. The solar panels do not require the accommodation to be co-located with the EVCP and the commercial building. There's no necessary link between EVCP for the pods and the 83 EVCPs. The technology is readily scalable and could equally well serve the pods in isolation from the wider whole. And the synergy between the sustainable destination to create a unique experience and the EV showroom is contrived. I then set out my summary on all of that. So finally, I come to benefits and planning balance. Mr. Ferguson has considered the benefits in his planning balance. It's not accepted that the use of the existing junction is a major benefit. Any new development to serve the A3 would almost inevitably be off existing junctions. The only outstanding issue is the weight to be attached to the biogas off-grid benefits. The proposal claims significant benefits in this regard. By being off-grid, it makes the provision of ECPs on the A3 possible, where the grid would not cope, and the specific technology captures bioethane as a renewable resource, saving greenhouse gas emissions and assisting the local economy. On examination, those benefits are overstated and do not apply here. First, there's no problem with grid capacity in this location. Second, on examination, it's clear that the sources of biogas are already used to generate electricity, including for the grid. So the greenhouse gases are already being caught and exploited. And third, there are potential benefits from Dr. Roy's technology in terms of purification, increasing the efficiency of the technology, and cylinderization, well, that's my attempt at a word, of the gases, making transport to off-grid areas easy. But there's no reason why the purification technology could not be used as part of the anaerobic digestion processes where the cells are already in use. The efficiency gains by deployment of purification are not dependent on there being a remote location such as this. And the lack of rollout of the technology after 10 years suggests some problems with translating the concept into an economic and scalable commercial proposition. None of the above is meant as a criticism of the basic intent of Dr. Roy to provide clean off-grid solutions through new technology, but the above points do limit the weight that can be attached to the benefits here. It is noted that the technology does not require a countryside location, does not require the accommodation to use the heat from it, and does not have to have a development of this scale to justify its use. No doubt if Mr. Roy's technology works as he envisaged it, it could be used in grid-served type developments in the future. It does not justify this scheme here. I then sum all of that up. The site currently exhibits and contributes to the key landscape characteristics of the national park in this landscape character area, which make up its foundational SQ1, and in visual terms, views to and through the site, revealing the special qualities. The A3 is a feature, but not dominant, and not such as to remove or undermine the key K2 characteristics. The impacts of the A3 on the need for this site to be protected have been the impacts of the A3 the impacts of the A3 on the lack of need for this site to be protected have been significantly overstated. The site is not calling out for new purpose, and the landscape and visual baseline here makes it an inappropriate location for development at all, never mind at this typology, scale, layout, and design. The landscape and visual baseline promoted by the appellant significantly understates its qualities and thus adopts the wrong starting point, and I repeat paragraph 2. The proposals are large-scale, dense and intense, and result in fundamental change to the landscape, its landscape character and views to and through it, directly impacting SQ1 and introducing an alien fauna into this part of the national park, directly contrary to SQ1, SD4 to 6. That harm is significant and is to be accorded great weight. The proposals constitute major development in the national park. There's no relevant need or justification for this development here. The only demonstrated needs are for EVCP, that should say rapid charging somewhere on the A3, and for visitor accommodation in the national park generally. There's no justification for the holistic approach in policy viability or synergy terms. The mix of uses is commercially driven and is contrived. Mr. Dunster is correct that this is on a correct analysis seeking to be a destination of choice for the national park. There is no possible arguable need for such a destination out of the settlement boundaries, and no such need is put forward. Given the location and nature of the site, there are high hurdles for any development on this site, including need, alternative sites and solutions, essential need for countryside location. None of these hurdles have been addressed, never mind overcome. There are some acknowledged benefits, but they are not exceptional and do not come close to outweighing the harms. Finally, standing back, this is a major commercial development in the national park, beyond the settlement boundary, on land exhibiting and contributing to the special qualities, including being part of a sublime view. This is simply the wrong place for amongst the largest EVCP locations in Europe, a large hotel and a commercial destination of choice, and therefore we'll be asking you for the permission be refused. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Mr. Forsted. Right, so I think we'll take a short break before coming back to hear from the appellant. So I'm going to leave the meeting entirely, but there's no need for everybody to do that if you want to just mute microphones and cameras until we resume. So we'll adjourn until 11:30, please. Okay, the inquiry is resumed. Thank you, everyone. I've had your written closings, Mr. Williams. I think that's been circulated to everyone, so thank you for that. So when you're ready to deliver them, please.
Thank you very much, sir. I hope to get through them in about the same time as Mr. Forstick, so it's probably going to be about an hour. I will go quickly, given it's written where there is written materials, where I depart from my text. So I'll make that clear, and we'll endeavour to speak more slowly so you can take a note of that. I think there are probably going to be 4 or 5 occasions where I'll have to do that.
Right, thank you.
Right, well, we start with Recharge 1 and it being a holistic proposal. And we opened this inquiry by outlining the concept of Recharge 1. And we begin these closings by explaining what it is not. We do so because throughout this inquiry, Recharge 1 has been repeatedly mischaracterised by the authority. That mischaracterisation has not even been consistent. The proposal has variously been described as an intense commercial development, as though Recharge 1 were an out-of-town supermarket, a large new settlement, as though we are proposing an urban extension, and a trunk road surface station, as though Recharge 1 was akin to Petersfield service area. Whether the mischaracterisation is intentional, enabling a straw man to be constructed in order that it can be argued that there is no essential need for proposing the countryside location, or unintentional, the product of seeking to pigeonhole Recharge 1 into existing typologies, we know not. What we do know, and what is evident from the evidence before this inquiry, is that none of the characterisations of Recharge 1 advanced by the authority is remotely accurate, either as a matter of form or as a matter of function. As to the form, the artist's impressions in the DAS alone give lie to the authority's mischaracterisations. We ask rhetorically, what trunk road service station, urban extension, or out-of-town supermarket has ever looked like this? As to function, Recharge 1 is a wholly new concept, one which marries much needed high quality tourist accommodation, critically important electric vehicle charging infrastructure, and housed within the earth sheltered building, which is about as far away one can get from an out-of-town supermarket, a small farm shop and cafe showcasing the best of local produce, an information centre helping to introduce people to the special qualities of the national park, as well as an electric bike hire facility and vehicle showroom promoting the preeminent modes of sustainable transport. All of this powered and heated by an innovative off-grid solution which will reduce the emission of highly potent methane from local agriculture. The constituent elements of Recharge 1 have a symbiotic relationship. The farm shop and cafe are critical to the proper functioning of the electrical vehicle charging and eco-lodges. Having sufficient electric vehicle charging points is the key to the desirability of the eco-lodges. The solar panels on those lodges will provide electricity, which, together with biogas, will power the site as a whole. The byproduct of the conversion of biogas to electricity, heat, is used to warm and potentially cool the earth shelter building and eco-lodges. Now, the symbiosis is financial as well as functional, and this is true in at least 2 respects. First, it's self-evident that the cost of installing electrical vehicle charging infrastructure on this scale, together with the costs of pioneering biogas technology, will not come cheap. One does not need specific financial evidence to appreciate as much. The revenue from the tourist accommodation will help to ensure that the installation and operation of the requisite infrastructure is viable. To stand a chance of securing the necessary electric vehicle infrastructure by 2030, let alone net zero by 2050, we need projects that are deliverable and achievable on the ground now, not simply vague promises on a page. As Mr. Heifer explained, the eco-lodges are not enabling development in the conventional sense, justifying otherwise unacceptable development because of the greater good it will facilitate. Instead, this is a case of 2 forms of much needed and beneficial development, accommodation and EV charging, which have a financial link enabling the business model to work. Secondly, business visitors who will be attracted to stay in the eco-lodges, due in part to the easy access to the food and drink in the cafe and farm shop, will supplement the tourist visitors who tend to stay primarily at weekends and holidays. Seasonality is a real issue for tourist accommodation in the national park, and I put note 8 there. It's identified within the VAR itself. It's also a note that was raised by Mr. Bird, the owner of the Nest. Now, the mix of uses on this site helps to insulate Recharge 1 against that challenge. So I depart slightly from my text here. It was said in opening that viability was a key element of the holistic approach. It is an element, and an important element, but it is not the only element of the holistic approach. There is the functional symbiosis as well as the financial one, and it's important that one recognises that they are linked, that the uses are linked in more than simply matters of finance. Turning back to my script, paragraph 11, nor is the mix of uses contrived as the authority alleges. Their interrelationship has been carefully thought through and results in a proposal whereas the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. The fallacy of the authority's salami slicing approach, treating each constituent part of Recharge 1 as though it was a standalone proposal without considering the whole, is perhaps best illustrated by Mr. Ferguson's assessment of the proposed cycle hire facility. His contention that given the existence of a cycle hire facility at the Queen Elizabeth Country Park, there is no need for one in this location, entirely ignores that Recharge 1 is not promoting a standalone cycle hire facility. Instead, the electric bikes on hire will allow those staying in the lodges or day visitors making use of the slow EV chargers to cycle from the site to the Queen Elizabeth Park via a dedicated off-road cycle path in circa 10 minutes and up Butser Hill in circa 20 minutes. It matters not that there is an existing cycle hire facility in the Queen Elizabeth Park. That would not benefit people staying at Recharge 1. I do note there, paragraph 11, that footnote 11, that as Mr. Dunst said, that facility, for what it's worth, is only open seasonally in weekends and holidays. Ultimately, it's the site's location within the national park and its location close to important attractions, such as the Queen Elizabeth Country Park, which provides Recharge 1 with its raise and deck throw. As Mr. Lester memorably explained it, Recharge 1 is the theatre to the national park stage, enabling people to enjoy and learn about the special qualities of the national park, whether they're staying for 1 hour, 1 day, 1 week. And so I'd just ask you to, when you have time, to read my footnote 12. I anticipated here the accusation that what we were doing was to be promoting a scheme where the commercial uses became the destination of choice within the park. Mr. Forsdick has alighted upon one sentence within the DAS that was then replicated within Mr. Dunster's proof. But that sentence has to be read in context. And I'm reading here from my footnote 12, halfway down. The immediate context, immediately before Mr. Dunster's quote, was that the ESB, the Earth Shelter Building, will showcase the very best the National Park has to offer. He was making clear what the ESB was doing there. But more importantly, it has to be read together with the vision for the Recharge 1, which was set out in the DAS, and unequivocally establishes that it is the National Park which is the ultimate destination. Mr. Dunster was clear about that in his evidence, explaining that Recharge 1 celebrates the genius loci. Furthermore, as Mr. Heifer explained in his evidence, the commercial use on site is plainly ancillary in size and in function to the two major uses, EV charging and tourist accommodation. When I return to my main text, that is not ex post rationale. It's all to be found in the vision, the big idea set out in the DAS. And whilst we ask you to read it in full, we quote from its conclusion section. We now have a roadside community powered from sun and farm gas with no need for fossil fuel that encourages passers to dwell and engage with the countryside that they pass through, maybe taste the view and savour the produce from local farms, and park or walk and cycle into the landscape or walk the dog up Butser. And maybe people understand and appreciate what they normally streak past. It is the park that provides the raison d'etre. Turning then to the special qualities of the park and the relevance of the special qualities. The first purpose of the national park is, of course, to conserve and enhance the natural beauty, wildlife and cultural heritage of the area. National policy tells us that great weight must be given to these factors. To understand what it is about the natural beauty, wildlife and cultural heritage of the park which make it worthy of designation and the highest status of protection, further detail is needed. That's where the special qualities come into play. As the local plan recognises, It's the combination of these special qualities that led these areas, national parks, to being designated to be protected as national parks. When assessing the effect a proposal may have on the natural beauty, wildlife or cultural heritage of the national park, it's only logical to focus on the identified special qualities. This was the approach taken by Inspector Downs in the Wallingford decision, in which he concluded that the scenic beauty of the area, in that case an A and B, was determined by its special qualities and distinguished impact on the special qualities from general landscape impact. Both Mr. Childs and Mr. Ferguson agreed that this approach was correct, with Mr. Ferguson accepting that the critical issue of the overall effect in para 176 terms, i.e. on natural beauty, wildlife and cultural heritage of the area, turns on a judgment of effect of the scheme on the special qualities. The impact then of Recharge 1 on the special qualities. And the South Downs National Park has 7 identified special qualities. And it's necessary to have regard both to the contribution that the site currently makes to those qualities and to the impact, positive or negative, that development would have on those qualities. And we say, as it currently stands, the site makes no meaningful contribution to the special quality of the park. In contrast, the proposal would contribute significantly to these qualities in a number of respects were planning permission granted. This means, we say, Recharge 1 would result in a net benefit in terms of the para 176 factors, to which great weight must be given. And I start with SQ1, diverse, inspirational landscape and breathtaking views. Apart from its wooded edges, the appeal site cannot be said to positively contribute to an inspirational landscape or breathtaking views. And to the extent the site could be described as diverse, this is not a positive attribute. The construction of the A3 some 3 decades ago resulted in a blighted piece of landscape, fragmented by the road system. It's not representative of the wide landscape character area, let alone what makes the national park special. Recharge 1 will, we say, make a positive contribution to this quality, in particular by providing opportunities for the public to enjoy impressive views from the appeal site of the Scarp. Instead of speeding by on the A3 with their eyes on the road, those who stop at Recharge 1 will be able to pause and appreciate the inspirational view, whether we're walking on top of the earth-mounted building or enjoying a picnic in the wildflower meadow. The proposal will make available to the public what is currently only available to ponies. Ms. Childs agreed that when viewed in isolation, the appeal site itself did not contribute to SQ1. However, she asserted the appeal site nevertheless contributed to this special quality in 2 ways. First, because it formed part of the inspirational views from Butser. Secondly, as undeveloped land in the foreground, it contributed to views to the Scarp from the bus stop on the B2070 viewpoint 3. She twice confirmed in cross-examination that on her own assessment, these 2 views were the only contribution that the site makes to the first special qualities. And so just on that point, you'll have your own notes, the cross-examination, and I've put a note in the book there as to the specific agreement. I think, Mr. Angel, I think you're, yeah, thank you. And we'll come on to general landscape and visual impacts in a moment, but Ms. Childs was quite clear in cross-examination which of the views she said contributed to this, the special qualities. Now, turning to those, the inspirational view from Butser will be materially unaffected by the development. It would not be visible from the very top of the hill, which is identified as one of the authority's key views. And where it would be visible, the proposal would not be noticed within the broad panoramic sweep unless the viewer was straining to pick it out. As Mr. Fanshawe explained, the breathtaking view from Butser will remain unaffected. Having had regard to the Hayes-Davidson visualisations, Ms. Childs accepted that, subject to the visualisations being accurate and being considered in the context of the site visit, A, the site would not read as a solar farm, B, the earth shelter building would be largely hidden, and importantly, C, that there would be no immaterial impact on the SQ1 qualities from Butser. Whilst of course visualisations are not a substitute for a site visit, there's been no suggestion by the authority that HD visualisations are in any way inaccurate, or at least rightly so. Hayes-Davidsons are leaders in the field of visualisations, having had over 30 years of experience in computer-aided illustration. Their visualisations have been relied upon in many public inquiries. Now, it's important, sir, to understand that the visualisations, the HD visualisations, unlike the photomontages produced for the Livia, had the advantage of a mock-up placed on site, as Mr. Fanshawe explained. And I explained there what that wooden frame structure consisted of, and why it's important to have regard to those. But it's also important to have regard, picking up midway through paragraph 27, that the visualisations, whilst they take account of the proposed tree removal on the northern boundary site, do not account for the additional mitigation on-site planting proposed by the landscape strategy, nor do they account for any further growth in the existing boundary planting because they're year one visualisations. We would therefore, sir, invite you to rely upon those visualisations as an accurate representation of the impact the proposal will have on views from Butser. If they're accepted, then on the authority's own case, Recharge 1 would not have a material adverse impact on the first special quality as a result of views from Butser. Indeed, sir, we would invite you to arrive at that conclusion, even if you were to disregard the visualisations. As will have been evident from the site visit, the appeal site forms a very small part of the panoramic views to the north from certain locations on Butser Hill. It's not contained within, and therefore would not affect inspirational views to the south, towards the Isle of Wight, or to the west, towards the Meon Valley. Where the site is visible, it's well contained by boundary vegetation. And in any event, the sweeping views to the north already contain a significant amount of built development. To the extent that Recharge 1 would be visible in these views, it would not be noticed. Petersfield, Bedford Road Industrial Estate, and the row of light-coloured houses at Greenway Lane are far more prominent, noting that even Petersfield is said by the local plan to be well hidden from longer views. It's for this very reason that Miss Childs was driven to include red arrows in her proof of evidence to identify the site in views from Butser. She had to do so because you wouldn't otherwise notice it. The contention that changes in views from the bus stop, viewpoint 3, would give rise to harm to the first special quality is entirely misconceived, and we say it should be rejected for the following reasons. Firstly, the suggestion that this view materially contributes to the first special quality entirely ignores its context. The view is from a bus stop on a busy B road. Any receptors would be acutely aware of their immediate surroundings, which include the underpass, the roundabout, the prominent row of houses on Greenway Lane, and the noisy scrapyard behind. It's hardly the inspirational landscape or breathtaking view that springs to mind when one visualises the South Downs. Second, the view of the scarp from the bus stop is filtered by the boundary vegetation even in the winter, as shown in viewpoint 3. In the summer, the view of the scarp from the bus stop is at most a glimpsed one. Third, to the extent that the Scarp Bridge can currently be seen from the bus stop, these views would not be blocked by development on the appeals site as the sections produced by Mr. Fanshawe demonstrate. Fourth, and in any event, Recharge 1 would allow people to enjoy far clearer views of the Scarp from the rooftop of the earthbound building or the wildflower meadow. In reality, far from being harmful to the first special quality as a result of the impact of views to the Scarp, Recharge 1 would improve the opportunity for the public to enjoy those views, and to do so from a far more pleasant environment than is currently provided by a bus stop. It would, in any terms, it would in those terms make a positive contribution to the first special quality, but on any account, it cannot be said to materially harm this quality. If, as we invite you to do, sir, you find that there's no material harm to views from Butser towards the appeal side, or to Butser from the bus stop, then on the authority's own case, Recharge 1 would cause no harm to the first special quality. Then the second special quality, wildlife and habitats. The circa 15% biodiversity net gain constitutes a demonstrable betterment to wildlife and habitats within the national park. As confirmed by both Mr. Charles and Mr. Ferguson, it is common ground that Recharge 1 would positively benefit this second special quality. And special quality 3, tranquil and spoiled places. On any account, the appeal site cannot be considered to be either tranquil or unspoiled. It's located in an area which is identified to be of low tranquility currently. Mr. Charles agreed that the appeal site does not currently possess the attributes of the third special quality and that it could not lose what it doesn't currently possess. Indeed, Recharge 1 will reclaim at least some of the tranquility by virtue of the improved oral experience on a substantial part of the site as a result of the air shelter building and acoustic screen. That improved experience will be appreciated by those staying in the eco-lodges or enjoying the wildflower meadow. So if anything, the proposal will result in improvement of the third quality, but on any account, it will not harm it. Special quality 4, an environment shaped by centuries of farming embracing new enterprise. The appeal site plainly does not currently contribute to this quality. It is, as Mr. Fanshawe says, a piece of one-time farmland fragmented and isolated by the road system that's looking for a new purpose. As was accepted by Mr. Ferguson, Recharge 1 would positively contribute to the fourth special quality and in a meaningful way. That contribution will be multifaceted and substantial, including the following. Firstly, Recharge 1 itself is a new form of enterprise which should be embraced not least because of the significant contribution it makes to meeting the challenges of climate change. Second, the local produce on offer in the farm shop and cafe will help to support the farms and enterprises in the national park. And third, the biogas will be sourced from local farms, including those within the national park, assisting with the farm diversification. In fact, so I should say, will be sourced from those farms in the national park if you accept the condition as now drafted. SQ5, great opportunities for recreational activities and learning experiences. One of the driving forces underlining Recharge 1 is to facilitate recreational activities in, enjoyment of, and learning about the national park. The proposal will actively encourage people to leave their cars and connect with the national park, whether by tasting its produce, enjoying views of Butser on the site, or using it as a base, whether for an hour or a week, to explore its many attractions in the vicinity. This is to be set against the baseline where the site currently offers no such opportunity. The proposals are therefore entirely consistent with the national park's second purpose, to promote opportunities for understanding and enjoyment of the special qualities by the public. The authority accepts that the site could act as a base for visitors to explore the park, and Mr. Ferguson confirmed that it was well located in terms of a number of destinations. Plainly it is. And Mr. Marshall gave evidence, which was not contradicted or disputing cross-examination, that key local attractions were easily accessible by foot, bike or bus. And so I set those out there. They're well known and I don't read those out. Mr. Ferguson accepted that as it would facilitate access to national park attractions, Recharge 1 would make a meaningful contribution to the fifth special quality. However, he sought to temper this contribution by suggesting that the special qualities of the national park would not be appreciated by those staying on site. That contention was also made in the authority's opening. That contention should be rejected. It results from the authority's mischaracterisation of Recharge 1, which has blinded them to the opportunities the proposal will offer to all visitors to engage with and learn about the park's special qualities. From those who sample its produce in the farm, shop and cafe, to those who learn about the national park in the information centre, to those who simply pause and enjoy the views, whether dramatic views of the Scarp in the day or the Milky Way at night. Recharge 1 would make a significant contribution to the fifth special quality and the national park's second purpose, both for those who use it as a base to explore elsewhere and for those who choose to remain on site. Sixth special quality, well-conserved historical features and rich cultural heritage. The site has no historical features of note nor contributes to the park's cultural heritage. It's arguable that the truly innovative nature of Recharge 1, being in the vanguard of sustainable tourism, would contribute to quality. At the very least, it's common ground that there would be no adverse impact on it. Turning then to the final special quality, distinctive towns and villages, communities with real pride in their area. Apart from SQ1, this is the only special quality that the authority alleges the site currently contributes to and would, on their case, be harmed by the development. Mr. Charles says that the site's undeveloped character, in short, the fact it's an undeveloped greenfield area, contributes to the settlement pattern of the area by being undeveloped. Her view, as we understand it, is that by allowing development which is effectively amounts to a settlement, her words, on the appeal site, it would disrupt the existing settlement pattern of the area, which is part of what makes its villages, such as Buriton, distinctive. The fallacy which undermines this analysis is that Recharge 1 will not read as a settlement. As Mr. Charles accepted, all sorts of development, such as road infrastructure, tourism facilities, minerals development, do not reflect settlement pattern, but do no harm because they do not read as settlements. And the same will be true of Recharge 1. No one could mistake it for a settlement, whether at a strategic or local scale. Therefore, although the appeal site will no longer be a green undeveloped field, albeit a green field which is already surrounded on all sides by road infrastructure, that will not disrupt the settlement pattern of the area. Ms. Charles accepted that her assessment was predicated on Recharge 1 being read as a settlement, and if this was not accepted, that her allegation of harm in respect of SQ7 fell away. Indeed, in an attempt to make good at this point in cross-examination of Mr. Fanshawe, my learned friend was forced to define settlement as meaning a built form of development. The hopelessness of that position is evident from just a moment's thought. On this basis, an MSA, a train station, a park and ride, or a retail superstore would be a settlement, even though by definition they would necessarily take a different form to and read differently from a settlement in the ordinary sense of the term. So too with the appeal site. Even if, contrary to our case, Recharge 1 is somehow read as a settlement, any harm to the settlement pattern is minimised by the fact that the proposal is not in the middle of a large undeveloped gap. It's in close proximity to existing residential development, a scrapyard, a quarry, and a business park and a busy road system. At worst, Recharge 1 will have a neutral effect on the seventh and last special quality. In fact, we say it would possibly contribute to this quality. Properly understood, Recharge 1 should be a source of pride for the local community, an exemplar of sustainable development in the national park. Conclusions then on special qualities. Recharge 1 would transform a site which currently makes no material contribution to the special qualities of the national park to one which makes a substantial contribution to them. Its most significant contributions would be to SQ2, Wildlife and Habitats, SQ4, Embracing New Enterprise, and SQ5, Recreation and Learning. But it would also materially benefit SQ1, Inspirational Views, and SQ3, Tranquil and Unspoilt Places. Even if the authority's case in respect of harms from the bus stop and settlement passing are accepted, the net impact, we say, would still be positive. And either way, Recharge 1 will make a substantial positive contribution to the very qualities which led the South Downs to be designated as a national park. Turning then to other alleged harms, and starting with the landscape and visual impact and the baseline assessment. Now, as I've just explained, Recharge 1 will conserve the breathtaking views and inspirational landscapes which help to make the park special. In doing so, it will conserve the natural beauty of the park. But in addition and beyond that, the general landscape and visual effects of the proposal will be limited. Any adverse effects will be localised and will not amount to significant environmental effects. The difference between the parties in relation to the general landscape and visual effects turn to a significant degree on the baseline assessment of the appeal site. As my learned friend said by way of an aside in opening, the parties' baseline assessments of the site are like ships passing in the night. There would appear to be 2 points of agreement between the parties. First, as Ms. Chard accepted, if the whole park were like the appeal site, it would not be designated. Second, the authority appears to accept that the site is remarkably well contained from the A3 as a result of its tree boundary. Beyond that, there is little agreement. We say, and we would invite you to find, that the landscape character of the site was fundamentally altered by the construction of the A3 over 3 decades ago. As a result of the road, infrastructure of the site is isolated and fragmented from the wider area. The site was plainly disturbed by the extensive engineering works. Shortly after, and no doubt because of the fragmentation, it ceased to be used for its historical land use, agriculture. Apart from the boundary vegetation, ancient stream, and views out of the scar, it does not currently contribute positively to the character of the area. Furthermore, its condition, which we have not confused with character, is poor. The suggestion in cross-examination that Mr. Fanshaw's assessment of the baseline was myopic, considering only the negative aspects. It's wholly inaccurate. As is clear from Appendix 3 of the Libya, the landscape baseline table, Mr. Fanshaw took care to identify the positive landscape baseline attributes of the site, as well as those factors which detract from its character. Those informed the design of the scheme, as Mr. Fanshaw explained. This point is emblematic of the unwarranted attacks made on the Libya by the authority, none of which have any force. Just to pass my text, 2 points on that. So one paragraph, footnote 59, I just take a number of the quotes from the landscape baseline table, which make it clear that Mr. Fanshaw had assessed that which was positive as well as that which was negative about the site and its contribution to the landscape character. But I would like to respond to my own friend's point in opening, which is found at paragraph 11 of his, his closings, I'm sorry, paragraph 11, where he accused Mr. Fanshaw of ignoring or belittling the features of the site, and went on to say at paragraph 16 that Mr. Fanshaw's approach results in the appellant leaving key elements of the baseline out of consideration. In my submission, that contention should be rejected, must be rejected. One has to read the Libya as a whole, but if one looks just simply at Appendix 3, it's clear. Firstly, Mr. Fanshaw engaged with the LCA, the Landscape Character Assessment, and in particular, the area of interest here in which the site sits, K2. And it's it's also clear that he identified from that those characteristics to which the site contributed. Most prominently, the wooded boundaries, the ancient stream, and the inspirational views of Butser. It's simply wrong to say the appellant left key elements of the baseline out of consideration or did not consider what the LCA had to say about its key characteristics. Turning back to my script at paragraph 60, Ms. Child's contention that the site continues to make a meaningful contribution to the character area ultimately boils down to the fact that it was historically a small and irregular field, and it remains a small and irregular field. In her view, the amendments to the site boundary as a result of the road construction, only the eastern boundary remains intact, did not fundamentally change the character of the site. The flaw in Ms. Child's assessment is that it entirely ignores the context. The Peel site may well remain a small and irregular field, but whereas it once formed part of a wider mosaic of agricultural land, it's now severed from that land by significant road infrastructure on all sides. And I just pause there to say, sir, that it's not simply the A3. Of course, the A3 is possibly the most substantial road intervention. But we have, of course, the underpass, the B207, the slips, such that this is not a site where there's substantial road infrastructure on one side. It is surrounded on all sides by such infrastructure. Turning back to my script, the severance is functional as well as physical. The appeal site is no longer farmed, and as Ms. Fanshawe explained, is no longer capable of being viably farmed. The character and use of the appeal site was changed irrevocably by the construction of the A3. Its redevelopment provides an opportunity to revitalise that which over 3 decades ago was despoiled. Turning then to the landscape effects, largely a result of the existing character and condition of the site and the limited extent to which it contributes meaningfully to the important characteristics of the area, the landscape effects of this scheme will be minimal. That which is important in landscape terms, the vegetated boundary, save for the loss of some trees on the northern boundary only, and the ancient brook, will be retained. And as explained above, the impressive views of the escarpment will be preserved and will be accessible by far more people. The design of Recharge 1 therefore respects and reinforces the positive attributes of the site. Ms. Charles disagreed with Mr. Fanshawe's description of the perception of the site being a cut-off island, somewhat despoiled and unloved, but accepted that should you, sir, agree with that characterisation, then you, sir, would have to necessarily reject the basis for Ms. Child's assessment of landscape impact. We submit the description is an accurate one, and that Ms. Child's analysis of landscape impact can and should be rejected on that basis alone. Nevertheless, it's clear that Ms. Child's contention that there would be significant detrimental changes to people's experience of this landscape, its quality and characteristics, is hyperbole of the highest order. Her analysis does not stand up to scrutiny. By way of example only, A, for the reasons we've already discussed, the settlement pattern of the area would not be adversely affected. B, the allegation that the site plays an important gap function is self-evidently not correct. This is illustrated not least by the fact that although the Buriton Village Design Statement goes as far as to identify important gaps in the parish, the appeals site does not fall within any of such gaps. It's most unfortunate that whilst Mr. Charles made reference to and relied upon the relevant gap policy in the design statement in the proof of evidence, she did not make it clear to the reader that the appeal site does not fall within or even near to any of the important gaps which the Buriton design statement itself had identified. And finally, the suggestion that the development of the site would lead to coalescence is, with respect, hopeless. Coalescence occurs when the development causes 2 separate settlements to merge or be perceived to have merged, with a consequent and harmful erosion of their separate identity. Plainly, that will not occur here. Indeed, my learned friend implicitly acknowledged as much by his use of his term agglomeration in place of coalescence. But that can't be what Miss Charles meant, because she specifically rejected the suggestion that by coalescence she meant encroachment, the suggestion put in cross-examination. He rejected that. And even if agglomeration with Greenway Lane was what Miss Charles meant, she accepted that being situated in proximity to existing development would be less harmful than if it were located in an open landscape. Turning then to visual effects. As explained above, the proposal would have minimal, if any, impact on long-distance views, specifically those from Butser Hill. As Mr. Fanshawe explained, the impact of views from Butser, even at year 1, would at most be moderate adverse. Now, if the Hayes-Davidson visualisations, which show the situation at year 1, are accepted as being accurate, as we say they should be, it's common ground that the impact would not be of a magnitude which would give rise to SQ1 harms. By year 10, even in glivia terms, the existing harm would be negligible. That depends primarily on further growth of the existing boundary trees, but as Mr. Fanshawe explained, there is every reason to consider this will take place. In terms of local views, the thick boundary vegetation means only that heavily filtered views of the development will be seen. This will be augmented by planting on site, the efficacy of which was explained by Mr. Fanshawe and no longer appears to be disputed. The exception is in views from the north through the entrance to the site, where there is currently and will be a break in the vegetation. These are represented by viewpoint 3, which has been discussed already. The earth shelter building sits below the height of the trees on the western boundary. In the summer, the vegetation is likely to block views from the A3 into the site. In winter, the views obtainable are likely to be glimpsed at most. That much is illustrated by the photos produced by Mr. Charles, which show winter views along the A3. Now, it should be noted, of course, that whilst these photos from the A3 looking directly into the site, those travelling along the A3 would, doing so at speed up to 70 miles an hour, hopefully have their eyes on the road, and views of the site are likely to be fleeting and peripheral. As Mr. Fanshawe concludes, the residual impact on local views will be at worst minor adverse. Now, all this assumes that changes in views from an undeveloped greenfield land to views of development, whatever its form or aesthetic, is necessarily harmful. Now, that's a matter of subjective judgment. It appears to be the basis for Mr. Charles' assessment, given her confirmation in response to your question, sir, that it would be preferable if development were invisible. But that's not a view to which we subscribe. We consider that views of the A3, from the A3, of the earth shelter building, a building which is specifically designed to read as part of the landscape, would be attractive and would provoke interest. In short, in our case, the development would have a positive effect on local views. But even if this is rejected, and the orthodoxy that built development is necessary and axiomatically harmful is accepted, the harm is minor, localised, and not significant. Turning then to the issue of ash dieback and boundary planting. Although not mentioned in the committee report or reason for refusal, the authority now raised concern about the potential impact of ash dieback. In particular, the question of whether the existing containment of the site by its tree boundary can be assumed for the future. The existence of ash dieback in some of the boundary trees is a red herring in this case. There is no proper basis on which to conclude the appeal site will become materially less well contained in the future. First, the proportion of trees affected by ash dieback on the western and southern boundaries is relatively low. These boundaries provide the most important containment. They screen and filter views from Butser as well as the A3. The original method statement explained that shelter belts 2 and 3 of the site have a proportion of ash, some of which shows sign of ash dieback. Further examination by the specialist arboriculturist has identified there are 3 distinct pockets of ash trees in the shelter belt 2, amounting to approximately 10–15% of the species mix in that shelter belt. These are not currently suffering from ash dieback. Secondly, the majority of the boundary trees are located within the extent of the adopted highway. The stated policy of national highways in respect of ash dieback is to 1. Prolong tree life through careful management, 2. Only remove ash trees if they have to, when it's a safety hazard because of they're dead or dying, and 3. Where they can, replace the trees to reduce the impact of the disease on the environment. Mr. Fanshawe has confirmed as much through discussions with national highways. Thirdly, Ms. Charles makes much of the success of the tree planting along the entirety of the A3, which has helped to reduce the influence it has on the landscape as it passes through it. Now, that is true, but the authority can hardly champion the success of the tree planting along the A3 over the last 30 years, and yet at the same time raise concerns about the ongoing boundary planting which screens the appeal site itself. If ash dieback is going to be an issue for the screening of the appeal site from trees on the national highway land, and we don't say it is, but if it were, then as Ms. Charles accepted, that's likely to be replicated along the entire length of the A3 and will necessitate a significant intervention. In any event, even if ash dieback would become a material issue, mitigation planting is proposed and be secured under landscaping condition. This planting will be agreed with the authority, but is shown in illustrative form on the latest landscape proposals. Turning then to the dark night skies issue. There is significant amount of common ground between the parties in relation to this issue. It is agreed, A, that the lighting proposals exceed, that is, do better than, the technical requirements established by the local plan and the TAN for this buffer zone. As Mr. Spreadbury explained and Mr. Oakley agreed, the lighting strategy exceeds that which is required both by the ILP guidance and the max lux level for the area. In respect of the latter, the lux levels proposed on the site are far better than the maximum lux levels established for the area. Accordingly, the proposals comply with policy SD83, the technical requirements. It's also agreed that lighting cannot be avoided, has been demonstrated to be necessary and appropriate, and that if there are any adverse impacts, which we say there are not, they have been mitigated to the greatest reasonable extent. Accordingly, the proposals comply. It is common ground with policy SD82, the hierarchy. It's also agreed that SD81 has to be read, as all policies do, with common sense. It is not simply breached. It's not breached simply because light can be seen from outside the site, which is within a sensitive area, such as a buffer zone. Policy SD81 is only breached, it is agreed, if the development would either threaten the intrinsic quality of dark night skies or the integrity of the dark sky core. And as I say, it's agreed in cross-examination by Mr. Oakley to that effect. Mr. Oakley also confirmed that he's no longer alleging that the proposal would A, fundamentally threaten the long-term sustainability of the dark night sky reserve, B, erode the pinch point, or, as he had alleged in his initial consultation response, present a significant threat to the buffer zone. The only difference between the parties is simply whether the residual lighting effects are moderate, as Mr. Oakley judges them to be, or negligible, as Mr. Spreadborough and we judge them to be. Moreover, as became clear in cross-examination of Mr. Spreadborough, the authorities' case is actually restricted to the contention that moderate effects were experienced in 2 locations, adjacent to the southeast of the Peel site on the slip roads to the A3 and from Butser. And Mr. Spreadborough's judgment, we say, should be preferred for reasons which we'll come to shortly. But even if Mr. Oakley's assessment is to be preferred, as Mr. Spreadborough had confirmed, this magnitude of harm, the moderate magnitude of harm, would not give rise to a breach of policy SD81. It would not threaten the intrinsic quality of dark night skies or the integrity of the dark sky core. Indeed, it's telling that in his proof of evidence, Mr. Oakley does not allege that residual impact would be a significant one, and does not allege that policy SD81 is breached, nor was such an allegation advanced in examination in chief. In any event, Mr. Spreadborough's judgment is plain to be preferred for the following reasons. Firstly, the immediate context of the site is important. As can be seen from the night photos from Butser or Little Butser, the site is located between 2 significant light-emitting sources, the A3 to the west and the highly lit roundabout, as well as Greenway Lane, to the east. As Mr. Spreadborough explained, the lighting intervention proposed by this scheme would be far less intrusive than existing lighting with the area. B, the lighting strategy exceeds in a number of respects the requirements of the local plan, and it incorporates appropriate dimming and lighting of off curfews. C, there'd be negligible impact of the lighting scheme on the sensitive receptors, such as those from Butser or Buriton Dark Skies Discovery Site. D, Mr. Oakley had mistakenly assumed that Mr. Spreadborough had restricted his assessment to upward light ratios. As Mr. Spreadborough explained, that's not correct. He took a rounded assessment of residual effects, having regard inter alia to the site's context, the appropriate receptors, and the degree of mitigation proposed. E, the height of the authority's case is that SQM levels adjacent to the existing slip road at the southeastern end of the site will be worsened. Plainly, this is not a sensitive location. People do not come to stargaze here. Those using slip roads are in cars and will be acutely aware of the headlights on the road. The proposal would not breach Air Policy SD8, nor give rise to any material harm to dark night skies, either to the core or buffer zones. Turning then to design. As has become increasingly apparent throughout this inquiry, the authority's case in truth is not predicated on concerns about the specific design of the scheme. The authority have an in-principle objection to the proposal being on the site, indeed on any greenfield site in the national park. And so I say it's evident from a number of sources that I set out there. But it's also evident from the authority's closings. Paragraph 2, this is simply wrong in principle. So I won't read A to C there because it is, I think, quite clear what their case is. But if the authority is going to realise its stated objectives in terms of sustainable tourism and to meet the challenges of climate change, innovative and pioneering design will be required. Producing more of the same is simply not going to cut it. National policy and guidance recognise as much. National policy explains that whilst development should be sympathetic to local character and history, this should not prevent or discourage appropriate innovation or change. Likewise, the National Design Guide tells us that well-designed places do not need to copy their surroundings in every way. It's appropriate to introduce elements that reflect how we live today, including innovation or change such as increased densities, and to incorporate new sustainable features or systems. For the reasons clearly and eloquently articulated by Mr. Dunster, Recharge 1 is an exemplar in innovative, sustainable design. This closing does not, nor could not, seek to repeat as evidence, which speaks for itself. it is evident that care has been taken to achieve a high-quality, landscape-led design. Mr. Charge accepted. In short, means simply good contextual design. A design which responds appropriately to its context, whilst reflecting and furthering the pioneering nature of the scheme. And so I depart from my text to respond to one contention made in closings, which was that the allegation that the proposal had taken no design cues from the landscape whatsoever. Now, it's correct to say that the design has not sought to replicate the architectural design of nearby settlements, because we're not proposing a settlement. But the design has been informed by the landscape and has been landscape-led in a number of ways. I come on to describe those in paragraph 84, and I'll read that in a moment, just for your note. The earth-sheltered building is a building which is integrated into the landscape and is designed to, in time, be read as part of the landscape. It has been designed in such a way that in terms of its cut and fill, they are broadly equal. And it has the function of improving the poor tranquility of this site. The eco lodges, for instance, their layout has been informed by the ancient stream and follows that gentle curve, and their orientation has been such that they benefit from views either to that stream or to the wildflower meadow. So we reject the contention that the design is divorced from the landscape in which it is located. And I come on then at 84 to read examples of how the main elements of design have been landscape-led. The earth-sheltered building, with its deep soil cover of chalk grassland, its earth-filled geotex retaining walls, its undulating roofline, will be perceived as an inhabited hillside, fully integrated into the landscape. However, its form plays an important function, the one function I've just mentioned about the acoustic screen. And then furthermore, the volume of the fill required to construct the ESB is virtually equivalent to the spoil produced by the site excavation. The eco-lodges, we say that they contribute, well, they do contribute significantly to the sustainability credentials of Recharge 1. Manufactured in National Park, clad in chestnut, harvested from National Park, and covered by integrated photovoltaics made in National Park. The low reflectance panels will produce significantly more renewable energy than is necessary for the eco-lodges alone, with the surface being used for EV charging. But at the same time, the lodge design has been produced specifically for this site. As I said, the gentle layout curves to follow the line of the ancient ditch whilst respecting existing tree canopies. They will not, as suggested in cross-examination, present as though they were military barracks or a mobile home park. Their orientation maximises solar harvesting whilst permitting axial views of the wildflower meadow and the boxy ancient ditch. The internal layout of the lodges has been generated by the external landscape, accounting appropriately for privacy, daylight and views. And then in terms of landscaping is integral to the proposed design of this proposal. The ESB is a roof covered in chalk grassland and well-vegetated green walls, and a significant area of the centre of the site is given over to wildflower meadow, a key design driver. And the existing boundary will be enhanced by on-site planting. Now, the authority, led, we have to say, by Mr. Waller, have taken a superficial, regimented approach to the concept of landscape-led design, one which fails to recognise that a new architectural language is required to meet the critical challenges that society faces today. An ecological vernacular derived from contemporary understanding of building physics, local material, the weather, and its capacity to change with the climate, as well as site context, geology, and terrain. Recharge 1 is in the vanguard of this contemporary vernacular and constitutes high-quality design. So I pause there to pick up the closings at paragraphs 88 to 91. Where my learned friend refers to the history of this site and the scheme evolution. Just a couple of points from that, if I may. He says at paragraph 88 that nobody at this inquiry has even started to try to justify the proposals in the 2019 pre-app. Well, no, we haven't, because that's not the design or proposal that is before you. It's a wholly different proposal. And having had the pre-app response, the design team went away for a period of over 2 years, back to the drawing board. And developed this wholly different scheme, and that can be demonstrated simply by comparing the plan that we put in, the brief that underlay the 2019 application, with the proposals before you. Secondly, sir, my learned friend then alighted upon the option that we disclosed on Friday, and we did so because it demonstrated that, contrary to my learned friend's assumption, there would be some required level of minimum development or parameters. It doesn't do. It doesn't provide for any such thing. It doesn't set the parameters. It doesn't set a baseline in terms of amount of development. It has an agreed figure, a redacted agreed figure for the price of an option, but that's wholly unsurprising, given that you can't have an agreement to agree. But so ultimately, in the third point, is that we say this is entirely a red herring in the history. It's a red herring, one, because the assumptions made by my learned friend as to how the scheme evolution influenced the design are wrong. But secondly, it's entirely irrelevant to the question you have to ask yourself, which is whether the design of the proposal is of high quality and acceptable. Even if, which we reject, it was driven by commercial consideration, even if it wasn't, we reject that. If the design is acceptable, that's what you've got to focus on. Turning then to a number of miscellaneous points, and I'll take these reasonably quickly, that have arisen. First one, this is my script, page 29, paragraph 87, poorly located for sustainable modes of transport. The allegation made by Mr. Ferguson and in opening the site is poorly located for sustainable modes of transport is absurd, sir. It ignores two key objectives underlying Recharge 1. First of all, a central focus of the scheme is to facilitate and promote use of electric vehicles, both through the provision of EV chargers themselves, but also the EV display space. Electric vehicles are the preeminent mode of sustainable travel today, and in that way alone, Recharge 1 will contribute significantly to the government's objective to promote use of sustainable transport modes. But secondly, Recharge 1's location within the national park and its close proximity to key tourist attractions is central to the concept. It's therefore entirely unsurprising that, as Mr. Marshall explained and is addressed above, the site is very well located to local tourist attractions. And therefore, being situated adjacent to the most heavily trafficked road in the national park, and yet easily accessible to the important local attractions, Recharge 1 will serve as a mobility hub, a place where people switch from one form of fast, sustainable transport, electric vehicles, to other, slower forms of sustainable travel, bus, bike, or foot. This allegation there'd be a high proportion of internal combustion engine vehicles. A further point made against the scheme is that it will be used by a large number of people who drive cars with internal combustion engines. Mr. Marshall thought the proportion of EV users of facilities would likely be slightly more than the current proportion of EV cars on the road currently. That may or may not be true. It may be thought that its facilities would encourage a higher proportion of EV users from day one. But even if it is, the criticism ignores the fact that, as Ms. Norton explained, there's going to be an exponential growth in EV vehicles in the next few years, particularly as we get close to 2030. Thus, the proportion of EV users on the site is likely to grow significantly. Moreover, as Mr. Heifer explained, the parking management plan could be used to discourage the use by internal combustion engine vehicles by charging owners of such vehicles to park. Indeed, doing so would align the commercial incentives of the operator, who would not want to miss out on revenue stream by virtue of an ICE vehicle taking up a charging space without using for and paying for that charging. Finally, as Mr. Ferguson accepted, to the extent that petrol heads use the site, they may well be persuaded by the ease of charging, the high quality facilities and electric vehicle showroom, and we certainly hope they would be, to take the leap to EV ownership. Recharge 1 will therefore help to facilitate the substantial behaviour change that will be necessary if we're going to meet the 2030 targets for electric vehicle ownership and ultimately net zero by 2050. Then, inappropriate mix of EV charging points. It also appears to be suggesting against the proposal that the mix of EV charging points on offer does not meet the identified need for rapid and ultra-rapid charging points on the strategic road network. As will be explained below, there is an urgent need for EV charging points now at a national, regional and local level, and a need for plurality of charging speeds to meet differing requirements. The suggested mismatch was in part the result of misunderstanding as to what is meant by fast charging points on the application plans. That was clarified by Ms Norton, and the appropriate kilowatt bands for each speed are to be incorporated into a condition. However, it also stemmed from the continuing misconception concerning the objectives of Recharge One. It is not, nor is it intended to be, a green petrol filling station. It, of course, has fast chargers, the equivalent of rapid or ultra rapid, for those who want to stop off for a short break on a longer journey. However, its primary focus is to encourage people to dwell and to facilitate the enjoyment of the national park, whether on-site or off. Hence, the skew in the proposed mix towards medium and slow chargers is fully consistent with the underlying philosophy of the scheme. As Ms Norton explained, these charging rates will be cheaper for the end user. Someone who's staying overnight or coming to visit the national park for a day would not need and would not want to pay for the extra cost of a facility to charge their vehicle in circa 30 minutes. Then the innovative technology and institutional experience. In his rebuttal proof, Mr Ferguson appears to call in question the feasibility of the biogas technology, as well as the institutional experience of those delivering the project. It's well established that biogas have an important role to play in meeting the 2050 net zero target. And so I cite there from the government's industrial strategy, as well as the European Biogas Association. I don't read those out, but they both make it clear that biomethane has an important role to play. And as we explained in opening, Recharge One will be the first of its kind. It's a pioneering and exciting scheme, and that's not something we shy away from. The expert evidence to this inquiry, including Dr. Roy's evidence on biomethane technology, shows that the project is well informed, realistic and achievable. Noticeably, the authority brought forward no evidence, expert or otherwise, to gainsay the appellant's expert evidence concerning the feasibility of the technology. Furthermore, the authority does not have many options to embrace renewable energy, given that large-scale wind farms and solar PV farms are generally not possible without causing substantial adverse effects to the landscape. Biogas doesn't face those difficulties. However, conventional biogas technology is concentrated around grid connections and a poor 30% efficiency. In contrast, Recharge One will make the conventional biogas technology far more attractive through portable, ultra-high energy bio-CNG cylinders powering fuel cells, operating at up to 90% efficiency, using otherwise wasted stranded biogas or feedstock, causing avoidable methane emissions. And so just on that, and the closings at paragraph right at the end, the numbering reverts to number 1 again, but it's at page 25. Page 25, paragraph 4E. My own friend says, in my submission, wrongly, that the efficiency gains by development of purification are not dependent on there being a remote location such as this. To be absolutely clear, Dr. Roy's evidence was that the efficiency gains in his technology are realised far greater on an off-grid proposal such as this than if it was simply plugged in to the national grid. And he explained as much, not least in response to my own friend's questions. Turning then back to my script, paragraph 101, in order to achieve the results that the government expects, indeed demands in respect to the provision of electric vehicle infrastructure, specifically, and meeting the challenges of climate change more generally, then innovative schemes will be necessary. We cannot continue with the status quo. It's unsurprising the opponents are unable to point to direct comparables because there are none. The scheme is truly groundbreaking. The ambitious and innovative nature of the project should be embraced by the authority. It is, after all, national policy reflected in the local plan, which tells us that national parks should lead the way in adapting and mitigating to climate change. And one of the identified priorities of the management plan is to establish South Downs as an exemplar in sustainable tourism. Recharge One would help to the authority to achieve both those aims. So I then go on at 103 to 104 to set out the institutional experience of those both providing the charging infrastructure and those providing the hotel accommodation and cafe. I don't read those out. They're points that were clearly made, one by the City Charge letter, and then secondly by Mr. Lester in his examination in chief. Turning then to chapter 5 on page 34 and the para 176 factors. We know what the first purpose of the national park is to conserve and enhance natural beauty, wildlife and cultural heritage area, and that great weight is to be given to those considerations. And it is common ground the appeal scheme would conserve the cultural heritage, and 108 is common ground that the Recharge One would enhance the wildlife of the national park. And the point I make here is that crucially, the net gain is achieved within and will benefit wildlife within the national park, and that's secured by the 106 agreement. And we say that that's a demonstrable benefit which goes significantly beyond policy and future legislative requirements. But in addition, the creation of on-site habitats appropriate to the local area and with a noticeable interest, such as the grassland and wildflowers, will, as Mr. Whitby explained, integrate nature into the development, improving and creating a greater resilience and biodiversity and educating the public. Finally, at a more general level, the role Recharge 1 will play in the necessary sea change to electric vehicle use will in turn help reverse the harm that diesel and petrol vehicles have on the habitats, in particular the sensitive habitats which the A3 passes through. So there is a net benefit in a number of ways to the second element, the wildlife considerations. Turning then to the effects of the scheme on the natural beauty of the park, conservation of natural beauty is not to be equated with the proposition that any degree of landscape or visual harm, however minor or localised, should be avoided. If that were the case, development of greenfield sites in the national park could never occur. As the inspector examining the local plan explained, there is no requirement to avoid any harm whatsoever to its landscape, and instead decision makers are entitled to make an informed, balanced judgment on the capacity of the landscape to accept development in the park, whilst according priority to the first purposes. Furthermore, as the Wallingford decision underscores, assessing the impacts on natural beauty should focus on the extent to which a proposal would impact on the special quality of the park. And so I say in para 110 that we ask you to conclude that Recharge 1 would cause no material harm to natural or landscape beauty of the park, and that there would be no harm beyond minor, localised, and significant and not significant harm to landscape and scenic, to the landscape and visual impacts, and they're not simply of a magnitude. They're simply not of a magnitude to cause material harm to the natural beauty of the national park. And crucially, Recharge 1 would significantly contribute to and not detract from special qualities. Now, so at 111, if that submission is accepted, then Recharge 1 would give rise to a net positive in terms of the 176 considerations, to which a great weight would be given. But even the alternative, even if you were to conclude that contrary to our primary case, Recharge 1 would cause limited harm to the natural beauty of the park, we submit that such harm is patently outweighed by the demonstrable and significant benefits to wildlife. Again, this would give rise to a net positive in respect to para 176 considerations. Mr. Ferguson accepted that if balancing of the 176 characterisations resulted in a net positive, planning permission should be granted irrespective of whether or not the scheme should be treated as a major development. That was not an equivocal response. Mr. Ferguson confirmed as much on 3 occasions. I put those at footnote 115. He was right to do so. If a proposal results in a net benefit to those factors which justify the South Downs status as national park, it would require countervailing considerations of substantial magnitude to justify refusal of permission. There are no such considerations in play here. It follows that, and this is an important point which is why it's emboldened it, it follows that on the authority's own case, permission can only be refused if you, sir, were to find that Recharge 1 caused significant harm to the natural beauty of the national park, and that such harm is not outweighed by the significant benefits of the scheme. Mr. Ferguson agreed that because the special qualities are the essence of what makes the national park important, the critical issue of overall effect in para 176 turns on a judgment of effect of the scheme on special qualities. As explained above, the authority contend that the appeal scheme is harmful to SQ1 as a result of the views from Butser and to Butser, and SQ7 as a result of the interruption of the settlement pattern. Now, Mr. Ferguson accepted that on the authority's own case, unless the authority could make good at least one of these 3 contentions, then there would be no harm to the natural beauty of the national park, and accordingly, permission should be granted. It follows that the authority's case boils down to Butser, bus stop, Buriton, or bust. For the reasons given above, the national park's special quality will not be harmed by Recharge 1, either as alleged by the authority at all. There's no proper basis for concluding that the scheme would give rise to material, let alone significant harm to the natural beauty of the park. If you agree, sir, then para 176 considerations tell in favour of Recharge 1, and permission should be granted on that basis alone. That is without even factoring the multifaceted and substantial benefits to which we now turn. Chapter 5, and then para 177, the major development in exceptional circumstances public interest test. I start with the question about whether Recharge 1 is major development. The test for major development is well known. It involves a site-specific, project-specific assessment, having regard to the proposal's nature, scale, setting, and whether it could have a significant adverse impact on the purposes for which the area is designated. Mr. Ferguson's approach was to focus primarily on the final consideration, the potential for significant adverse effects. He was right to do so. There is little reason why the restrictive policy approach established by Para 177 should apply to developments which do not have significant adverse effects. Mr. Ferguson also accepted that if USER agreed with Mr. Fanshawe the proposal would not have any significant adverse effects, it would be open to USER to conclude that it did not amount to major development. And we contend that Recharge 1 should not be treated as a major development. It will not have significant adverse effects. Specifically, most importantly, it will not have significant adverse effects on the special qualities, the purposes for which the area has been designated. That is the most important consideration. Its nature, scale, and setting do not compel a different conclusion. Turning, though, to the exceptional circumstances in the public interest test, and even if you were to conclude that the appeal scheme constitutes major development, there are clearly exceptional circumstances, and it is plainly in the public interest to grant permission for Recharge 1. We begin by noting that the mandatory considerations under Para 177 are mandatory considerations, but they are considerations only, not criteria which are required to be passed. And I start with A, the need for the development. Recharge 1 would help to meet a number of critical and urgent needs. First, it would make a meaningful contribution to tackling climate change. Quite apart from providing the much needed infrastructure for electric vehicles, which I'll come on to, Recharge 1's contribution to meeting climate change is multifaceted. First, the use of biomethane to power and heat the facility would reduce the harmful emission of methane from local agriculture, a greenhouse gas which is far more potent than CO2. Second, a significant amount of solar energy would be harvested from the PV panels on eco-lodges, more than is needed to power the eco-lodges alone. The excess would be used to run Recharge 1, including charging the electric vehicles. Third, as it would rely solely on biogas and solar energy, electric vehicles at Recharge 1 would be charged from 100% renewable energy. This is far preferable to relying on the national grid to provide the power to charge electric vehicles, given that 60% of the power from the national grid is currently produced from fossil fuels. And whilst it's hoped that the grid will, in time, go green, off-grid solutions, such as biomethane, will continue to have an important role to play, both in reducing the demand on the grid, which is currently run at virtually full capacity, and which is facing massive additional burdens from the electrification of vehicles and the efforts to decarbonise the residential heating sector. And secondly, in helping to ensure the stability of supply, given the challenges of intermittency inherent in solar and wind power. Fourth, quite apart from, and in addition to its use of renewable energy sources, Recharge 1 would, through its design and construction, result in a 350% reduction of carbon emissions when compared to building regulation requirements, well in excess of the targets set by the local plan. And finally, the utilisation of an existing and substantial interchange and underpass on the A3 would make best use of a significant amount of embedded carbon. But secondly, there is an urgent need at national, regional and local levels for additional EV charging infrastructure. The need for sea change in EV infrastructure provision exists now. The national need for additional infrastructure to support electric vehicle charging is undisputed and undisputable. And I set out a couple of quotes from the government's electric vehicle infrastructure strategy there. But as Ms. Norton explained, if the current pace of rollout is continued, we will miss the minimum requirement of 300,000 chargers nationwide by 2030 by 20 years. It's worth underscoring that 20 years if we carry on going as we are. In order to meet the minimum requirement, delivery of EV infrastructure would need to accelerate to around 38,000 charge points per year or 730 installed per week. Now, the government recognises that it's only part of the solution and that the private sector has a critical role to play in providing convenient, affordable and reliable charging for all. And the urgent need to improve electric vehicle charging infrastructure is not confined to government strategies. It's also permeated the public consciousness, as the recent plethora of press articles to this effect attests. And as Mr. Ward's evidence explains, range and charge anxiety is proving to be a key barrier to the electric vehicle uptake. At the regional level, in order to meet the projected 2030 needs in the 3 counties in which the park is located, there would need to be at least a 4-fold increase in the current number of slow and fast chargers and a 7-fold increase in the number of rapid and ultra rapid chargers. Nor is that a need which can be addressed simply by repurposing existing fuel stations. Petrol stations are unlikely to convert to EV stations whilst there's still a market for petrol refuelling. And even when this situation changes, there are likely to be real difficulties given that petrol filling stations and MSAs were not designed with connections to the national grid in mind. Further, in any event, even in the extremely unlikely scenario that all 34 refuelling stations currently operating in and around the national park were fully electrified by 2030, wholly unlikely scenario, that would only account for between 11 and 23% of the anticipated regional demand for chargers. And so those figures are all predicated on the most conservative forecasts of EV uptake, and without accounting for either redundancy issues or demand during peak hours. That's all set out in Mr. Norton's evidence, which wasn't criticised on that point. At a local level, as explained by Mr. Norton, Mr. Marshall and Mr. Lester, existing provision for electric vehicle charging is extremely limited, disparate and unreliable. Thirdly, there is a demonstrable and acknowledged need for visitor accommodation within the national park. The local plan explains the national park is a major resource for recreation and tourism, which plays a significant role in the local economy. At 46 million visitor days per year, it's the most popular protected landscape in the country, and yet the average daily spend is the lowest of all 15 national parks. And the authority recognise that it's important to add to the accommodation within the national park in order to increase the currently low levels of average visitor expenditure. And we say we should add to allow more visitors to enjoy the special qualities of the national park for more than one day only. It's perhaps unsurprising, therefore, that the local plan recognises that there is a strong demand for high quality accommodation and clear prospects for future growth and demand for all types of visitor accommodation, and contains a strategic policy which positively supports proposals for visitor accommodation. And of particular relevance to Recharge 1 is the fact that the local plan and the VAR which underpinned it identified a clear gaps in accommodation provision, particularly hotel accommodation in Petersfield and accommodation supply along the South Downs Way. Those gaps remain unfilled today. The local plan only includes 2 allocations with tourist accommodation, neither of which anywhere near to the appeal site, and one of which has gained planning permission without the inclusion of any tourist accommodation. Mr. Ward's evidence demonstrates the consent granted for accommodation, which have been granted on unallocated sites, will do little to provide accommodation in the local area or meeting the markets provided for by Recharge 1. Finally, there is the need, consistent with the authority's statutory duty, to foster the economic and social well-being of local communities within the national park. And I set out there the ways that this proposal would do that. Turning then to the criterion consideration B, the cost of and scope for developing outside of the designated area, or meeting the need in some other way. As a starting point, as Mr. Heifer explained, unlike other policies within the NPPF, such as retail and flooding, this consideration does not require a sequential test to be applied, which only permits development if all alternatives have been ruled out. It follows that to the extent that criticism is levelled at the appellant for not having undertaken an exhaustive alternative site search, such criticism is misplaced. Moreover, the authority has not sought in any substantive way to dispute the existence or gravity of the needs that I've just set out. Their cases presented during this inquiry, and particularly as advanced through cross-examination, appears to be that there's no imperative or essential need to meet the needs within the national park, or at least in the national park on a greenfield out-of-settlement location. Now, that proposition should be rejected. It fails to acknowledge the urgency of the needs which Recharge 1 seeks to address, the role the national park will have to play in helping meet those needs, and the fact that if those needs to be met, development needs to be brought forward on sites which are suitable and available with alacrity. Starting with climate change, the authority's own management plan recognises that we are facing a climate emergency, and that in order to achieve net zero by 2050, their words, national parks must up their game now to meet this challenge, explaining not only that planning must work to combat climate change, but that a radical change will be needed to enable the landscape to combat change through carbon capture and reduced emissions. The authority's apparent position that developments such as Recharge 1 are to be welcomed, but just not in the national park, is the equivalent of Nero fiddling whilst Rome burned. The reality is that if net zero is to be achieved by 2050, then all areas of the country will need to contribute by embracing developments and technology which have hitherto not been permitted. And they need to act now. There is simply no option for only allowing such development outside the designated area. Turning then specifically to electric vehicle charging infrastructure, the urgency of the need is not nor cannot be disputed, nor do the authority deny there needs to be a substantial increase in the provision of EVs at regional level, including within the national park. Nor, it would appear, do they dispute that the A3, having by far the highest daily flows within the national park, is an obvious location to meet that need. Instead, the authority's case, primarily developed through cross-examination, as I say, appears to be that A, the majority of charge points will be provided at home or destinations. B, those travelling on the strategic road network will run rapid or ultra-rapid charging points rather than to dwell, the grid serve model. C, given the prevalence of home and destination charging, there will only be a relatively small demand for charge points on the SRN. And D, these can be provided on the A3 outside the national park or on brownfield land within the national park, such as existing petrol stations. Thus, they say, I make it clear that is as I understand the argument put against us, there is no essential need to provide electric vehicle charging points on this site. So we say, and we say it's self-evident, that this argument breaks down at every stage. First, it ignores that in order to meet the 2030 requirements, the infrastructure needs to be provided now. It's no use relying on a hypothetical scenario in which charging infrastructure is available in most homes and at most destinations. Mr. Ferguson accepted that he'd not given consideration to the urgency of the need for electric vehicle charging infrastructure when undertaking his assessment of Para 177. Secondly, the need for electric vehicle charging points of all speeds is overwhelming, as Ms. Norton's unchallenged forecasts demonstrate. And as the government recognises, a diversity of locations and speeds will be needed. Thirdly, the argument ignores that the Recharge 1 is not intended, at least primarily, to be a plug-and-go model of the grid-served type. The mix of charges is intentionally skewed to the slow and medium chargers, precisely because we want visitors to dwell and enjoy the national park. Thus, in this regard, the majority of the charging provision is more akin to that provided at a destination, the national park, which on the authority's own hypothesis will provide the bulk of the provision. Fourthly, given that destinations in the national park context are regularly to be found outside of the settlements, i.e. whenever people want to enjoy countryside of the national park, on the authority's own hypothesis, a significant amount of electric charges will be needed in the countryside, likely on greenfield locations. The current provision of electric charges for those seeking to explore the national park in this area is wholly inadequate for today's demands, let alone to meet 2030 needs. Finally, the prospect that sufficient provision will be made by 2030 on the A3 from yet unidentified sites, either outside the national park or on brownfield land within the national park, is entirely unreal. As Mr. Heifer explained, much of the A3 runs through areas which are heavily constrained by national park or greenbelt, such that there are necessarily limited opportunities to build sufficient infrastructure outside those areas. And as Ms. Norton's evidence demonstrates, the idea that sufficient provision will be made from the adaptation of existing petrol stations on the A3 is preposterous. So I pause there to pick up a point that was made in closing on a number of occasions. First of all, at paragraph 61 of my learned friend's closing. Where he says at paragraph 61, pre-penultimate sentence, the approach is circular. There is a need here because the development is here. And then he reiterates that argument at paragraph 70. One cannot generate a destination and claim there's a need for EVCPs to serve it, and they make provision of the EVCP the linchpin of the justification for the scheme, another clear illogical circularity. But we haven't created the destination. The national park is the destination. People who travel here, and by and large those who use this site, will be travelling to enjoy the national park. Recharge 1 will facilitate that. There is no illogical circularity. My learned friend at paragraph 66 makes this point again, last sentence, there's no justification for building a new destination with slow and fast EVCPs as a linchpin. The need is to fit such EVCPs in existing destinations. That's exactly what we're doing. The slow and fast chargers. Yes, there will be some. We do have the fast chargers who use the plug and go element, but the vast majority are there to enjoy the national park as a destination, and the site Recharge 1 will facilitate that. And what we're doing is to fit EVCPs in existing destinations where people come and enjoy the national park, and when doing so, charge up their electric vehicles. So I'd ask you to reject the contention that there's a circularity in our need case. As turning back to the script, 142, as to the provision of visitor accommodation, the local plan recognises that it's the national park itself which creates the need and demand for tourist accommodation, the point I was just making. Developing outside the designated area would only partially meet those needs. Nor is there any realistic prospect of all the need being met, that's all the tourism need being met by development on brownfield sites or within settlement boundaries. This is particularly true for provision of a suitable accommodation on or near to the South Downs Way, which is identified as a key lacuna in provision, and which is common ground that a proposal would usually serve. As Mr. Heifer explained, in order to even begin to meet these critical and urgent needs, it's necessary to capitalise on suitable sites which are available to development, and to do so now. There is simply not the time to kick the matter off to the long grass, or to rely on the needs being met through the allocation process. Turning then to the third consideration, detrimental effects on the environment, landscape and recreational opportunities, and the extent to which they can be moderated. Recharge 1 would have no detrimental effect on the environment. To the contrary, as we have explained above, it would have a substantial positive impact. Its impact on the landscape, including visual impact, would at worst be limited, localised and not significant. All opportunities have been taken to moderate those impacts, including through landscape and lighting strategies. And finally, it would have a substantially positive impact on recreational opportunities, consistent with the second purpose. Visitors Recharge 1, whether for an hour, day or week, will be able to enjoy and gain a deeper understanding of the special qualities of the national park. Conclusions then on para 177 of the test. The scheme would bring about a wide range of very substantial public benefits. Granting permission for the development is plainly in the public interest. As Mr. Heifer explained, the exceptional circumstances derive from a combination of the multifaceted and very substantial benefits, its remarkably limited adverse effects, and the appropriateness of the site for the proposed development. Now, the first two considerations have been extensively addressed above. However, we should focus for a moment on the appropriateness, indeed exceptionality, of the location. As was explained in opening, that derives from a combination of the following. Firstly, the site's location adjacent to existing road infrastructure, which allows for the operation of Recharge 1 without significant landscape, environmental or financial costs associated with the provision of an interchange, provides easy access from the A3, by far the most trafficked road within the national park, and as a result of the island of land existing road infrastructure is created, provides an opportunity to revitalise an unloved and despoiled site. Ms. Charles accepted that if you accept so that road infrastructure resulted in a field pattern that was no longer intact, which it plainly is not, we say, in the site, then this alone would mark out the site as exceptional in the context of the A3 hinterland. Secondly, its close proximity and good connections to key tourist attractions, and the confluence of the siting adjacent to the strategic road network and yet within easy walk access of foot, bike and bus to major tourist attractions in the national park is a distinct feature of this site. The local plan specifically identifies the need for additional tourist accommodation in the area. The challenge, it tells us, is to provide facilities which encourage more walkers and cyclists and fewer cars, given the small size of most settlements, the narrow roads and the scarcity of parking. Well, the location of the appeal site addresses all of those challenges. It enables visitors to access the national park directly from the A3 without needing to navigate the national park's narrow roads or settlements in their cars. It addresses the scarcity of parking in these locations. Having left their cars charging, whether on a slow charger or overnight, visitors to Recharge 1 will be able to explore the local attractions on foot, bike or public transport. And finally, its surrounding context, not simply the road infrastructure, but Greenway Lane, the well-lit roundabout, the noisy scrapyard and the large square quarry mean that whilst Greenfield, it is not a site in the middle of an unspoilt countryside location. Its suitability for redevelopment is obvious. Turning then to the development plan. Both parties agree that if the inspector concludes that Recharge 1 is either net beneficial in respect to the para 176 considerations or meets the 177 tests, then the scheme would also be consistent with the local plan as a whole. That is perhaps unsurprising given these considerations. That is perhaps unsurprising given that the considerations within para 176 are derived from the National Park's first purpose, and core policy ST3 directly reflects major development tests established in para 177 of the NPPA. In light of this agreement, we can address the development plan briefly, and in these closings focus only on core policy ST1, sustainable development, And so I say a far more detailed consideration of development policy can be found in Mr. Heifer's proof, and we rely on that, but I don't replicate that in these closings. On our primary case, Recharge 1 is consistent with policy SD1-2. The proposal is consistent with and will make a substantial contribution to the first and second purposes of the national park. However, even if that is rejected, Recharge 1 is consistent with policy SD1-4. The considerable and wide-ranging benefits of Recharge 1, including to the national park's wildlife, to which great weight is given, would demonstrably outweigh any limited and localised harm that may be caused to the landscape or natural beauty of the park, notwithstanding the great weight to be given to those factors. Moreover, even in that scenario, there would be substantial compliance with other relevant policies of the development plan, i.e. other than policies which relate to conserving landscape or natural beauty. Indeed, the proposal would have positive benefits in respect of SD9 biodiversity, SD23 sustainable tourism, SD34 local economy, SD48 climate change, and SD54 pollution and air quality, as well as being in compliance with other policies, including SD7 tranquility and SD8 dark night skies. Either way, the development being compliance with the first core policy of the plan, and we say will be in compliance with the development plan as a whole. Turning then to finally the conclusion. We end where we began, with Recharge 1. Recharge because it would facilitate the recharging of electric vehicles, of people, of nature, and of the country. 1 because it will be a first of a kind, pioneering and exciting scheme, precisely the type of scheme that will need to be embraced if we are going to meet the greatest challenge of our time, the existential threat of climate change. And all of this achieved with remarkably limited landscape impacts. Others have questioned why Recharge 1 should be located in a national park. We ask, why should it be located anywhere else? We can think of no better location for an exemplar in sustainable development whose raison d'etre is to celebrate the magnificence of its surroundings. If exceptional circumstances are required to be shown for the development to proceed, they more than amply exist. Accordingly, sir, we respectfully request that you allow the appeal and grant planning permission.
Okay, thank you for that, Mr. Williams. Okay, that brings us to the end of the inquiry then. Are there any matters to raise before we finish, please? Okay, well, thank you all very much for your contributions, and the inquiry is now closed.
Thanks, sir.
Goodbye.
Thank you, sir. Goodbye.